He didn't look rich sitting there. Just tired, hands folded on an untouched cup, the shine of his watch dulled by daylight. The woman who was supposed to meet him had seen the wheelchair and left before the chair across from him even cooled. 7 minutes had passed. Long enough for whispers to bloom like weeds around the table. Long enough for a proud man to remember exactly why he'd stopped trying to believe people could love him for who he still was. The city moved on. He didn't. Outside, snow floated like dust from a world that had given up on grace. Inside, the cafe hummed with the low chatter of lives that seemed effortlessly intact. Malcolm Cade, once the kind of name you'd read on glass towers, was now just another story the city told behind napkins. They called him the imbecile billionaire. A man who'd survived a car crash only to lose his balance, his words, and his rhythm. The newspapers had turned his tragedy into entertainment. The internet had frozen his stumbles into jokes. He'd learned to stop reading the comments. But shame, unlike headlines, doesn't fade. It lingers in the reflection of every polished spoon. It hums in every whisper that lowers when you roll into a room meant for walking. He'd tried to stay invisible, but that morning he'd made a mistake. He'd hoped. The cup before him was still warm. Not from his hands, but from the memory of wanting to be touched by someone again. The woman who had promised to meet him, an old acquaintance who'd reached out saying she admired his resilience, had frozen when she saw the wheelchair. She'd smiled in that brittle, frightened way people do when politeness is their only armor. Then she'd left, muttering something about a family emergency that both of them knew was a lie. Her perfume still hung in the air, faint, mocking, expensive. He told himself to leave. To call his driver, to return to the penthouse where silence didn't judge. But something inside him, some tired, stubborn echo of the man he'd been, refused. Pride can be cruel, but sometimes it's all a person has left. 7 minutes. That's how long it took for a man like Malcolm to remember that power and loneliness weigh the same when you're sitting still. 7 minutes of watching steam rise and fade, like breath leaving a body. 7 minutes of imagining every glance aimed at him, even the ones that weren't. 7 minutes of hating the fact that he cared. And then, a sound that didn't belong in this polished room. A small, bright voice that cracked the quiet in half. "Mommy, why is that man sitting all alone?" He froze. Before we dive into this story, tell us where in the world you're watching from and what time it is right now. Someone near you might be watching too. And don't forget to subscribe to support and appreciate the work we do on this channel. Heads turned. Conversation stuttered to silence. The question didn't come from malice. It came from the pure curiosity that only the innocent still own. Malcolm lifted his eyes, and the world blurred around one tiny figure. Near the door stood a little girl, 5 or 6 years old, her dark curls escaping from beneath a knitted hat the color of mustard. One hand clutched a lunchbox plastered with stickers, the other was wrapped around the hand of a woman wearing blue hospital scrubs. The mother looked exhausted but gentle, like someone who'd forgotten what rest felt like but hadn't forgotten kindness. The girl, Sky, stared straight at him, wide-eyed and fearless. Her gaze wasn't pity. It wasn't confusion. It was wonder. And for the first time in months, someone was looking at him instead of around him. Nora, the mother, felt heat rise in her cheeks. "Sky," she whispered, tugging gently on the child's hand, "that's not polite." But the girl didn't move. She tilted her head, studying him with the same intense seriousness a child gives to sunsets and stray cats. Malcolm tried to smile, but it came out fractured, an echo of a smile he used to wear when he could walk into a room and have the whole world listen. Now the only person who wanted to was 3.5 feet tall. Something in him. Something he thought the world had burned out, flickered. He wanted to say something kind. To tell her it was okay. But words had become fragile things since the crash. They often arrived too slow or too late. Before he could decide, the waitress came by with a look that made him feel smaller. "Mr. Cade," she murmured, "your driver's outside if you're ready to go." He nodded without answering. Ready. What a word. Ready for what? Another silent car ride back to an apartment too large for one man's regret? Nora's hand squeezed Sky's. "Come on, sweetheart. Let's sit somewhere else." But Sky didn't move. Her brow furrowed, and her voice, soft but certain, carried again. "He looks sad." Malcolm's chest tightened. It wasn't the words themselves, it was the truth of them. Simple, direct, delivered without cruelty. Sadness rarely survives being seen. It turns to something else. Nora hesitated. Nurses live in a world of small mercies and endless emergencies, and they learn to tell the difference between wounds that bleed and wounds that ache. The look in Malcolm's eyes was the latter. She sighed. "All right," she said softly. "We'll sit nearby. But be quiet, okay?" The girl nodded and climbed into the seat at the next table, the one closest to his. Nora ordered tea for herself and a blueberry muffin for her daughter. Malcolm watched as the waitress walked away, pretending to check her order pad so she wouldn't have to meet his eyes. He wanted to disappear into the chair, to shrink until he could fold himself into invisibility. But then Sky did something no adult ever would. She broke her muffin cleanly in half, wrapped one piece in a napkin, and slipped off her seat. Her shoes squeaked on the tile. The entire cafe seemed to hold its breath. She walked straight to his table and placed the napkin beside his untouched cup. "My mommy says everyone needs breakfast." Then she smiled. A small, unpolished smile, the kind that isn't earned, it's gifted. Malcolm stared at the muffin like it was a relic. He hadn't been offered something without motive in longer than he could remember. His throat tightened, and for a terrifying second he thought he might cry in front of strangers. He managed a nod. "Thank you," he whispered. The words sounded rough, like they'd been in storage. But they were real. Nora's eyes softened. Around them, the cafe slowly exhaled. The moment passed, but not completely. It left behind a thin, invisible thread, fragile, luminous, unspoken. Malcolm looked down at the muffin. One half of a whole. That's what he was now. But for the first time in years, he wondered if it was possible to feel full again. Outside, the snow thickened, erasing footprints faster than they could be made. Inside, something equally delicate began to take shape, two strangers, a child, and a moment of simple kindness that would ripple far beyond the walls of a corner cafe. He lifted the cup. The tremor was still there, but it didn't stop him. He took a sip. The coffee was cold. But somehow, his heart wasn't. And as the girl returned to her seat, smiling up at her mother, Malcolm Cade, billionaire, widower, survivor, and man forgotten by mercy, found himself wondering if Grace sometimes wears sneakers and carries a muffin. Nora Ellis hadn't planned to stop. Not today, not after 12 hours under hospital lights that never dimmed. Her feet ached in ways that even prayers couldn't soothe. But her daughter's question still hung in the air like a ripple that refused to die down. The man in the wheelchair hadn't looked pitiful. He'd looked, waiting. Not for help, but for permission to be seen. And there was something about that. Something that tugged at a part of her heart she usually kept locked for her own survival. Sky was still watching him, muffin crumbs dusting her little fingers, her curiosity innocent and unflinching. Nora sighed and sipped her tea, trying to anchor herself to the ordinary, 2 sugars, no cream, one fragile peace of mind. But ordinary had already left the building. Because she recognized him. It took her a moment to place the name. Malcolm Cade. The same man from the folded article she'd read in a break room months ago, the imbecile billionaire. She had skimmed the story while eating cold pasta, shaking her head at how the mighty fall. At the time, he was just a headline, another cautionary tale to scroll past between shifts. But here he was. Not a caricature or a scandal, just a human being who couldn't lift his coffee without trembling. She glanced at Sky, then at Malcolm. He was still staring at the napkin where her daughter had placed the muffin, like it was a message from some gentler world. "Mommy," Sky whispered, "he's lonely." The words pierced deeper than they should have. Nora thought of nights spent alone in the small apartment above the clinic, waiting for a man who would never come home. Her husband, her firefighter, gone in an instant of collapse and smoke. Grief had made her fluent in loneliness. She knew its shape, its color, its weight. She saw it now sitting across from that untouched cup. The waitress returned, her tone falsely bright. "Refill for you, ma'am?" "For the little one?" Nora nodded, but her attention stayed on Malcolm. His hand twitched, a subtle reminder of everything the world had taken from him. He wasn't helpless, he was haunted. And haunted people recognize each other. She leaned forward, speaking softly. "That was kind of you to accept her gift." His eyes lifted slowly, cautious, searching. For a moment, she thought he might ignore her. Then he spoke, voice steady but measured, like someone rebuilding bridges plank by plank. "Your daughter reminded me what generosity looks like." Nora's throat tightened. She wanted to tell him that Sky had always been that way, offering small pieces of the world to anyone who needed them. But something about the way he said it made her realize this wasn't just politeness. This was gratitude scraped from the bottom of the soul. He shifted slightly in his chair, trying to straighten a posture that pride wouldn't let him abandon. The light caught his eyes then, gray, weary, and intelligent. There was still life there, still a spark beneath the rubble. "Most people don't sit this close," he said quietly. Nora managed a half-smile. "Most people haven't seen what I've seen." The space between them changed. The silence wasn't awkward now, it was gentle, a silence that listened. Sky giggled softly, breaking the spell. "Mommy," he smiled. Malcolm's lips curved into something fragile but real. "She notices everything." "She gets that from her father," Nora said before she could stop herself. Then her voice softened. "Got it from him." She wasn't used to saying that sentence aloud anymore. Malcolm nodded slowly, as though honoring something sacred. "I'm sorry," he said simply. No platitudes. No pity. Just acknowledgement. The kind of sentence people stop believing exists. Nora looked away, blinking hard. She hadn't expected kindness to come from him, not today, not here. But grief recognizes its own. Outside, a bus hissed to a stop. The snow thickened, turning the city into a watercolor. Inside, something began to warm that had nothing to do with coffee or tea. Nora noticed a paper sticking slightly out of Malcolm's coat pocket, creased, folded, worn from being handled too often. She couldn't help but see the bold black print, Prescott Medical Holdings. Her stomach dropped. That name wasn't unfamiliar. It was stamped across the rejection letters that had nearly cost her her apartment after her husband's death. Her pulse quickened. The irony hit like a cold slap. She'd spent months railing against that corporation, calling it heartless, greedy, cruel. The man sitting 3 feet away from her was that corporation. She didn't speak. Not yet. The part of her that wanted to accuse was still wrestling with the part that had just watched him thank her daughter for a muffin. Life was cruel that way, it made you care about the people you thought you hated. Sky tugged her sleeve. "Mommy, can I draw him something?" Nora blinked. "Now?" "Yes," Sky whispered. "He needs something to keep." Nora hesitated, but handed her a crayon from her bag. She watched as Sky began sketching on a napkin. The small, deliberate strokes of a child who doesn't know she's performing surgery on someone's soul. When she finished, she hopped down and handed the drawing to Malcolm. He looked down. The napkin showed 3 stick figures, one tall, one small, and one sitting in a chair, but all holding hands beneath a bright yellow sun. For a second, he couldn't breathe. His chest ached, not the physical kind of pain, but the kind that means your heart still works. He swallowed hard. I haven't been in the sun for a long time. Nora's voice was barely a whisper. Maybe it's waiting for you. Something in him cracked open, not in defeat, but in release. The waitress brought the check, setting it gently on the table. Nora reached for her purse, but Malcolm stopped her with a look. Let me, he said. Please. She hesitated. Then nodded. Only if you promise it's not out of guilt. It's gratitude, he replied. And maybe, a start. They stood to leave together. He rolled forward, she guided Sky's hand into her own. The cafe door chimed, spilling them into the cold. The air hit like baptism, sharp, clean, real. For a long moment, they just stood there, 3 people who had no reason to meet, except that the universe sometimes chooses kindness as its punchline. Malcolm turned toward her. May I see you again? Nora hesitated, her nurse's instinct warring with her human one. Then she nodded once. We'll be here next week. Same time. He smiled. Then I'll try not to spill my coffee next time. She smiled back. And I'll try not to cry at muffins. They laughed, a sound that startled even them. And as they went their separate ways, neither noticed the old woman by the window, watching them leave with a knowing smile. She whispered to herself, the world remembers how to heal, one table at a time. The snow kept falling, quiet and endless. But the air between them had changed forever. For the first time in years, both of them went home lighter than they came. The next Sunday came heavy with gray skies, the kind that make the world feel slower, more honest. The cafe smelled of cinnamon and rain-soaked coats. Malcolm arrived early. Not because he was eager, but because waiting gave him purpose again. He wore a wool coat instead of a suit. The chair was polished, but less like armor, more like something he'd accepted as part of him. His driver offered to stay. He told him to take the day off. Pride could rest for a few hours. The waitress recognized him but didn't whisper this time. The headlines had faded, replaced by new scandals and fresher gossip. The world had moved on, but he hadn't, and maybe, for once, that was a good thing. He checked his watch. 10:58, they'd said, same time. He'd replayed those 2 words every night. They sounded simple but carried the fragile hope of a man who'd been forgotten by the calendar. When the door chimed, he almost didn't look up. But then came that small, familiar voice. Mommy, look. He's here. Sky ran ahead, her yellow scarf bouncing like sunlight in motion. Nora followed, carrying the calm strength of a woman who has survived too many storms to fear another. She smiled softly as she reached the table. You're early. I didn't want to miss the snow, he said, though both of them knew it wasn't the snow he was waiting for. They sat. Sky climbed onto her usual chair and began unpacking crayons. Nora ordered her tea. Malcolm, just black coffee this time. No sugar. No pretenses. For a few moments, they didn't talk. And it wasn't uncomfortable, it was gentle. The kind of silence that feels like breathing in sync. Nora noticed his hands were steadier today. The tremor was smaller, almost invisible. Progress. She smiled without saying anything. People healing deserve quiet victories. Then Malcolm spoke, low but sure. I remembered what you said, about the sun waiting for me. Nora looked up. And? I went outside yesterday. Without help. I sat by the fountain near my building. She smiled. How did it feel? Cold, he said. But real. I'd forgotten what real felt like. The words landed heavier than he meant them to. Nora nodded. Real hurts sometimes. But it's better than numb. He studied her face for a moment, tired eyes, strong jaw, that faint trace of sadness she wore like an old necklace. You sound like someone who's been through too much. She exhaled. Someone who's still learning how to live through it. He wanted to ask more, but her tone said not yet. Some stories needed to ripen before they could be told. Sky interrupted with the confidence of someone who has never known the fear of speaking. Mr. Malcolm, Mommy said you build big buildings. He chuckled softly. I used to. Now I just build excuses. Nora frowned slightly. Don't say that. He raised an eyebrow. Why not? Because you're rebuilding something more important. Yourself. Her words hit him harder than she intended. People had told him he'd recover, that he'd adapt. No one had said he was worth rebuilding. Not since the crash. The crash, those two syllables that still echoed like metal and glass. He swallowed hard, pushing the memory away. And you? You heal people every day. Doesn't that get heavy? Every night, she said quietly. But I keep going. Someone has to. Their eyes met, steady and unflinching. Two tired souls recognizing the same exhaustion in each other. Then the waitress came. Her tone was careful, polite. Mr. Cade, your assistant called. He said you shouldn't overdo it. There's a board meeting tomorrow. The room froze again, like it did that first day. Nora watched his jaw tighten. Pride flared. He hated being managed, pitted, or spoken to like porcelain. Tell him I'll handle it, he said sharply. The waitress hesitated, unsure, then nodded and left. Silence returned, heavier this time. Nora sipped her tea slowly, giving him time to settle. She meant well, she said softly. I don't need her meaning well, he replied, voice low. I need her to treat me like a man, not a project. Nora leaned back, choosing her words carefully. You scare people, Malcolm. Not because you're angry, but because you remind them how fragile they are. That's not your fault. He didn't answer. His hands gripped the wheels of his chair, knuckles pale. You're allowed to be frustrated, she continued. But don't aim it at the wrong people. I've done that. It never helps. Her tone wasn't scolding, it was understanding. The kind that comes from experience, not judgment. He let out a long breath. You sound like someone who's forgiven a lot. I'm learning, she said. Mostly from my daughter. She forgives everyone. They both looked at Sky, who was now drawing something new. A staircase, steep and winding, leading into clouds. She said it's you, Nora murmured. Malcolm blinked. Me? Climbing back up. The air shifted again. His throat tightened. The drawing was childish, uneven, but it was the kind of hope no adult could fake. He reached for his coffee. His hand was steady now. He didn't even notice. Nora watched quietly, proud of him without saying so. You know, she said, you're not as broken as you think. He looked up at her. Neither are you. For a moment, time seemed to hold still. The cafe, the snow, the hum of the city, it all faded into the background of two people learning what healing sounds like when it whispers instead of shouts. Sky leaned over and tugged at his sleeve. Next week, you should come see where Mommy works. She helps people get better too. Nora blushed. Sky, he's a busy man. But Malcolm's eyes warmed. Maybe I'm not too busy anymore. Her breath caught, because for the first time, his voice didn't sound like someone pretending to be okay. It sounded alive. They finished their drinks in silence. Nora checked her watch. It was past noon. She stood. We should go. Malcolm nodded. Same time next week? She hesitated, then smiled. Same time. As she turned to leave, he said softly, Nora, thank you. She paused at the door. For what? For sitting close. Her eyes softened. Everyone deserves someone to sit close. And with that, she left. Malcolm stayed behind, watching the door close behind them. The snow outside reflected off the window, turning his reflection into something unrecognizable, something lighter. He didn't know it yet, but he'd already started climbing those drawn stairs. And somewhere between pride and gratitude, the wall between them began to crack. The week felt longer than most. Snow came and went, but the air never warmed. Nora tried not to think about him, but grief has a way of echoing, especially when someone new starts to sound like hope. She had patients to tend, charts to fill, a daughter to raise. Still, whenever she passed the hospital lobby window, she caught herself glancing at the street as if a man in a wheelchair might be waiting there with coffee he couldn't drink but meant to share. Sunday came again, and she almost didn't go. The weather was cruel and her paycheck late, but Sky begged, eyes wide, coat too big. Please, Mommy. He might be lonely again. They went. The cafe was quieter this time. The kind of quiet that makes every sound matter. The door chimed, and there he was. Already seated, already smiling, the tremor in his hands smaller now, the loneliness in his eyes less visible. He'd saved their seat. That small, wordless gesture pierced deeper than any speech could. Nora sat across from him, pretending it was just another morning. It wasn't. The space between them carried the weight of unspoken things. Busy week? He asked. Always, she replied. Hospitals don't sleep. He nodded. Neither do regrets. She looked up, startled by the honesty. Still having those? Every night, he said quietly. They visit like old friends who forgot how to leave. She wanted to tell him that healing isn't forgetting, it's learning how to live beside pain without letting it drive. But before she could, Sky tugged at his sleeve. Mr. Malcolm, Mommy said you help people. He chuckled softly. Your mommy gives me too much credit. Nora smiled faintly. And you give yourself too little. That's when she saw it. The folded letter peeking from his coat pocket again. The same logo. The same cold serif font. Prescott Medical Holdings. Her pulse kicked. That letter wasn't just paper. It was the scar of her past, the one she'd buried beneath late shifts and forced smiles. After her husband's death, she'd applied for help. Financial relief for families of fallen emergency workers. A grant promised in glossy pamphlets, signed by a man whose name was now sitting in front of her. Malcolm Cade. She remembered the rejection. Insufficient documentation. The words had gutted her. She'd sent proof, bills, certificates. She'd written appeals. No one had answered. The last letter bore his signature, sharp, clinical, final. Her heart pounded so loud she barely heard him speaking. Nora? She blinked. Sorry. What were you saying? He studied her face. You look like you've seen a ghost. Maybe I have, she whispered. Sky was coloring quietly, unaware that the table had turned into a battlefield. Nora's throat burned. The urge to speak warred with the instinct to protect. That company. Prescott. It ruined me. After my husband died, I begged them for help. I begged you. The air froze between them. Malcolm's expression didn't shift at first. But then something in his eyes, recognition, horror, guilt, shattered through the calm. His hand went instinctively to his coat pocket, then fell uselessly to his lap. "I didn't know," he said, voice hoarse. "After the crash." She cut him off. "Don't. Please don't tell me you forgot. That paperwork carried my name. My husband's death certificate. My address. My daughter's age." Her voice trembled. "And you signed it away." Every head in the cafe seemed to turn again, but Nora didn't care. Her pain had lived in silence long enough. Malcolm's face went pale. His breathing uneven. "That wasn't me. After the accident, they handled approvals under my name. I couldn't." She stood abruptly. "I don't care what excuse they gave. You built it. You created a system that forgets people like me." He stared up at her, stunned, helpless, smaller than she'd ever seen him. "You're right," he said finally. "I did." The confession knocked the wind from her. She hadn't expected him to agree, to lay down his defenses so easily. Skye looked between them, confused. "Mommy, why are you mad at Mr. Malcolm?" Nora's lips parted, but no words came. "How do you explain bureaucracy and betrayal to a 5-year-old who still believes everyone means well?" Malcolm leaned forward, his voice barely a whisper. "Nora, please. Let me fix what I broke." "Can you bring my husband back?" she asked, eyes wet. "Can you give my daughter her father?" He didn't answer. Because there wasn't one. Silence again. Heavy. Holy. Finally, she exhaled. "I shouldn't have come." She turned, guiding Skye toward the door. But just as she reached it, he spoke. Not loud, not desperate, just steady. "You're right about everything," he said. "But don't let my mistakes keep you from kindness. Your daughter didn't." Nora froze. Her shoulders trembled. Then, without turning back, she left. The bell above the door rang once. Malcolm sat there long after the sound faded. The muffin crumbs were gone. The napkin drawing still rested in his hand, 3 figures under the sun, now blurred by the moisture of his thumb. He had spent months drowning in self-pity. But now, for the first time, he felt something worse. Responsibility. He pulled out his phone. "Get me the original relief grant files," he told his assistant. His voice no longer stuttered. "Every case, every denial. Starting with one name, Nora Ellis." The assistant stammered, confused. "Sir, that's years ago." "Then dig up years," he said. He hung up and stared at the empty seat across from him. For years, he'd thought his tragedy was the accident. He was wrong. His real tragedy was the people who'd been crushed under his success. Snow began to fall outside again, but this time it didn't look peaceful. It looked like ashes. Malcolm stayed until closing. When he finally rolled to the door, the waitress quietly pressed the child's drawing back into his hands. "She left this," she said. He unfolded it. The sun had faded, but the little figures still held hands. One line had been added, a door between them. He stared at it for a long, silent minute. Then whispered, "Not for long." And as he left the cafe, a plan was already forming. He couldn't rewrite the past, but he could reopen the door that his own signature had shut. The morning after Nora left, Malcolm woke before sunrise. Not because he couldn't sleep, but because shame had its own alarm clock. He sat in the dark, watching the city lights bleed through his blinds. Every window looked like judgment. Every car horn outside sounded like accusation. Her words replayed like a pulse he couldn't silence. "You built it. You created a system that forgets people like me." He had no defense left. Only memory. The boardroom had once been his kingdom. Now it was the scene of his quiet reckoning. When he arrived at headquarters that morning, the security guard froze. They weren't used to seeing him before the world woke up. The marble floor reflected the wheels of his chair like a mirror holding him accountable. He rolled past portraits of himself in younger days, standing, smiling, shaking hands with people whose names he could barely recall. Each photo felt heavier now. Success was supposed to age well, guilt didn't. Inside the elevator, his reflection was unrecognizable. He'd once loved this rise, the slow glide upward, the view expanding floor by floor. Now it felt like judgment climbing with him. He reached the top floor and pushed into the boardroom without waiting for permission. His executives looked up mid-coffee, startled. "Gentlemen," he said, voice measured but cold, "clear your morning." One of them, a man with a tie too confident for his soul, forced a chuckle. "Malcolm, you should have told us. We'd have prepared?" His tone cut like glass. "That's the problem. You only prepare for control. Not for truth." Silence. He laid a folder on the table, thick, worn, full of names. "These are the people our company turned away when I was recovering. The families who applied for relief we promised but never gave." Another executive leaned forward. "That program was suspended after your accident?" Malcolm's voice hardened. "No. It was murdered. And you buried it under paperwork." He flipped open the folder. Nora's name sat at the top. Her husband's death certificate clipped neatly beside a rejection letter carrying his own signature. His hands shook, not from weakness, but from fury. "You used my name to sign these," he said quietly. "You used my silence to excuse it." No one spoke. The only sound was the hum of the city below. The CFO cleared his throat. "Malcolm, you were unwell. The company had to continue operations." He slammed his palm on the table. The echo startled even him. "At what cost? At whose cost?" They flinched. No one looked at the papers. He took a breath, steadier now. "Reinstate the grant fund. Every denied case gets reviewed. Retroactively. I don't care if it bankrupts us. We'll rebuild with decency, not damage control." Someone muttered about budgets. Another about shareholders. Malcolm leaned forward. "You're looking at a man who lost everything money can't buy. Don't test me on what I'm willing to risk to get it back." No one argued after that. When the meeting ended, he stayed behind, staring out at the skyline he'd built, a city stitched together by ambition and arrogance. Somewhere out there, Nora was probably bandaging someone's wounds, unaware that she'd just reopened his. By noon, he was at his therapist's office. The same one he'd avoided for months. "You're angry," the doctor said after hearing everything. "I'm awake," Malcolm replied. "Those are not the same. They are today." He looked down at his hands, steady now. "She hated me. I deserved it. But when she left, I wanted to deserve better." The doctor nodded. "Then prove you do. Don't chase forgiveness. Build something she'd believe in." Malcolm's throat tightened. He nodded. "I already started." That evening, he called the hospital directly. No assistants. No PR filters. Just him. The receptionist almost dropped the phone when she heard his name. "Mr. Cade?" "Nora Ellis," he said. "What time does her shift end?" A pause. Then, 8:30, sir. He waited outside the side entrance, the one nurses used after long days, the one without cameras or ceremony. When she appeared, she didn't see him at first. Her head was down, steps slow, exhaustion clinging to her like fog. When she finally looked up, surprise flickered across her face. "You shouldn't be here," she said softly. "I probably shouldn't be anywhere," he replied. "But I needed to say something before excuses build walls again." She crossed her arms, weary. "I don't want apologies. I've heard too many." "This isn't an apology," he said. "It's a correction." She blinked, uncertain. "What do you mean?" "I went through every file with your name on it. Every signature. Every denial. I found out who made those decisions." His voice softened. "And I fired them." Her breath caught. "You, what?" "I also reinstated the relief program. It won't bring back your husband, but it might save someone else's." Nora stood there, frozen, her face unreadable. He continued quietly. "You said I created a system that forgets people like you. You were right. I built walls out of efficiency. I called it progress. But all it did was keep compassion outside." She looked at him for a long time, her eyes reflecting more pain than anger now. "Why tell me?" "Because you're the first person in years who's looked at me like I'm still human," he said. "And I don't want to waste that mercy." The wind pushed between them, carrying the smell of snow and gasoline. Finally, she said, "I don't know if I can forgive you." "I'm not asking for that," he said. "Just, let me keep trying." Her lips parted, but no sound came. The world around them blurred, the parking lot lights, the falling snow, the endless hum of life moving on without permission. Then Sky's voice cut through the night from the back seat of Nora's car. "Mommy, is that Mr. Malcolm?" Nora closed her eyes. "Yes, sweetheart. Tell him we missed him." Nora turned back toward him, her expression softer now. "Looks like my daughter forgave you before I did." Malcolm smiled faintly. "She's a better person than both of us." "Maybe," Nora said. "But she's also 5. She forgives everyone." He laughed quietly, the sound raw but real. "Then maybe she should run the company." Nora's lips curved into something almost like warmth. "Maybe she already does." For the first time since that day at the cafe, neither of them felt like strangers. The distance between them wasn't gone, but it wasn't endless anymore. She looked down at him, voice steady. "If you're serious about rebuilding, start small. Show up. Be kind. Don't disappear when it's inconvenient." He nodded. "Consider it done. And Malcolm," she added softly, "next time you bring coffee, make it hot." He smiled, a real one this time. "Deal." She walked away then, disappearing into the snowlit distance. He sat there a while longer, letting the cold bite at his fingers, feeling every second of it. For once, he didn't rush to escape the discomfort. It felt deserved. And somehow cleansing. He glanced at the hospital lights behind her, then up at the faint outline of the moon. For the first time in years, he didn't feel cursed by what he'd lost. He felt called to what he could still build. And as the snow gathered on his coat, Malcolm Cade realized redemption isn't found in apologies, it's earned in repetition. By the time February came, the snow had softened into slush and the city began to thaw. But inside Malcolm Cade's chest, the frost hadn't fully melted yet. Guilt didn't vanish, it transformed, reshaped itself into something that looked like purpose. He was changing quietly, not for applause, not for cameras, but for peace. The kind that no one writes headlines about. Each morning began the same, no boardroom, no chauffeur, no crowd. Just him, his wheelchair, a thermos of coffee, and a list of names, families his company had once turned away. He called them himself. No assistants, no script. When people realized who was on the line, they usually went silent first. Then came the voices, gravelly, weary, suspicious. He listened. Sometimes they cursed him. Sometimes they cried. Sometimes they just hung up. He stayed gentle through all of it. By the 5th week, word began to spread. Not the kind of gossip that fills tabloids, but whispers in the waiting rooms of hospitals, in church basements, at late-night diner counters. They said the billionaire who lost everything was calling people one by one, returning what the system stole. Some believed it. Some didn't. Nora didn't. She'd heard the rumors at work, patients talking about checks arriving, letters of apology signed by hand. But part of her refused to hope. Hope had failed her before. Still, when she got home one evening and saw the envelope on her kitchen table, her breath caught. Her name, in familiar handwriting. The same looped end she'd seen on a coffee napkin once. Inside wasn't money. It was a note. Short. Unpolished. Human. For every door my name closed, I'm trying to open one more. I won't ask for forgiveness, only permission, to do better. MK. No logo. No pretense. Just ink and sincerity. She read it twice, then placed it on the fridge with a magnet. Not because she forgave him, but because something about the words refused to be thrown away. At the company headquarters, things looked different too. Malcolm's once sterile office now had stacks of handwritten letters, thank you cards, and photos of families holding newly approved grant certificates. The sterile space had turned into a confession room, each name another prayer answered late. He'd hired 2 women from Nora's hospital as advisors, both nurses. They didn't wear suits. They wore sneakers and carried notebooks that smelled faintly of sanitizer. When they spoke, executives listened. It wasn't pity that drove him anymore. It was responsibility dressed as humility. Every Friday, he visited the hospital anonymously. He'd sit in the lobby cafe, different corner, same ritual, and watch. Watch Nora pass by in her blue scrubs, tired but purposeful. Watch Sky hop beside her, skipping between innocence and wisdom. He didn't approach her. Not yet. He wasn't ready to ask for a place in her peace when he was still learning how to protect it. But fate has its own sense of timing. One afternoon, while Nora was escorting an elderly patient out, she saw him across the lobby. No suit this time, just a dark sweater and gloves, a paper cup in his hand. Their eyes met through the glass, and something wordless passed between them. Recognition without intrusion. When she walked toward him, he almost smiled. Didn't expect to see you here. Same cafe, she said. Different reason. He nodded. Better one, I hope. She hesitated. Why are you here, Malcolm? He motioned to the floor-to-ceiling window beside him. Beyond it, a young man in a hospital gown was sitting in a wheelchair, staring at the snow. Alone. Forgotten. I come here to remember who I used to be, Malcolm said quietly. So I don't become him again. Nora followed his gaze. The man's fingers twitched against the wheel, weak, trembling. A volunteer handed him a blanket and walked away. I'm reopening the rehabilitation wing your husband helped design, Malcolm said softly. Before he died, he submitted blueprints. The board shelved them after his accident. I found them. Her breath caught. You, what? I wanted you to know before you read it in the news. It'll bear his name. The Ellis Wing. Nora stared at him, disbelief flickering between her lashes. Why would you do that? He looked down. Because I signed the papers that erased his name once. It's time to write it back. Her throat tightened. She wanted to stay angry, but grief and gratitude don't coexist easily. Sky ran up then, cheeks pink from the cold. Mommy. I saw a big truck outside. It said Ellis on it. Nora blinked, realizing he'd already started. Malcolm smiled faintly. You have a sharp eye, Sky. She grinned. Are you helping Mommy's hospital? I'm trying to, he said. Then you're a hero again, she said simply. The words hit him like sunlight after too long underground. Nora's eyes softened. Careful, she murmured. You'll start believing her. He smiled, but his voice trembled. Maybe I already do. Over the following weeks, something unspoken began to grow. Not romance, not yet, something slower, purer. Trust, shy and trembling. Malcolm began sending small things instead of apologies. A new wheelchair for the elderly patient who'd always waited alone outside. A heating unit for the nurse's lounge. Coffee vouchers for the night shift. He never signed his name. But everyone knew. Nora noticed the difference in the hospital's air. Staff smiled more. The weight had shifted. And somewhere in that quiet transformation, her resentment began to loosen its grip. One evening, she left her shift late and found Malcolm still sitting in the same corner of the lobby cafe, staring out at the snow again. Do you ever go home? She asked gently. He smiled without looking away. Sometimes home isn't a place. Sometimes it's where guilt starts to heal. She sat beside him. No more walls. No more accusations. Just shared exhaustion that felt almost like peace. You're different now, she said softly. I'm trying to be, he replied. Turns out decency is harder than profit. She laughed quietly. It was the first time he'd heard her laugh without sorrow underneath it. They sat in silence after that, both staring through the glass. The snow had stopped. The streetlights reflected off the wet pavement, making everything shimmer. Malcolm, she said finally, her voice fragile but kind, I can't promise forgiveness. He nodded. I'm not asking for it. What are you asking for then? He turned toward her, eyes steady. A chance to earn it. She looked at him for a long time. The world outside seemed to hold its breath. Then she whispered, maybe that's enough for tonight. He smiled faintly. It is. They sat there until the lights dimmed and the janitor started sweeping near their feet. Two people who had once been strangers, now bound by the same silent truth, sometimes the quietest repairs are the ones that last. And as Nora stood to leave, she realized something. She didn't dread seeing him again. Malcolm watched her go, the reflection of the Ellis Wing blueprint glowing on his phone beside the empty cup. For the first time since the accident, the future didn't look like punishment. It looked like purpose. The morning of the Ellis Wing unveiling began like a promise. The city shimmered beneath sunlight that had been missing for months, the kind that makes even broken glass look holy. Banners hung from the hospital's brick walls, names stitched in gold thread. The Ellis Rehabilitation Wing, a legacy of healing. Nora stood at the window of her office, staring at the crowd below. She should have felt proud, her husband's name was finally being honored, but pride had tangled with unease. This wasn't just a dedication. It was Malcolm's redemption written in marble. And something about that terrified her. She hadn't seen him all week. Not since the night they'd sat side by side in quiet understanding. His calls had stopped. His driver said he was resting. But she knew rest wasn't something men like Malcolm practiced. Guilt and ambition don't sleep. They only shift shape. By 10 a.m., the lobby filled with reporters, donors, and hospital staff. Flashbulbs flickered like lightning inside glass. The board members were there too, faces that had once turned away from widows and single mothers, now smiling for cameras. And then, through the sliding doors, he appeared. Malcolm Cade. No suit. Just a dark charcoal coat, hands folded on the wheels of his chair. The crowd quieted, as if sensing that the man arriving wasn't the same one whose name had once filled business headlines. He looked thinner. Paler. But calmer, too, like a storm that had finally found its center. Nora stepped forward before she realized she had moved. "Malcolm," she said softly. "You came." He smiled faintly. "Wouldn't miss it. I promised your daughter I'd be here." Her chest tightened. Skye was in the front row, clutching a small bouquet of lilies, bouncing with excitement. "Mr. Malcolm. We saved you a seat." He laughed, a low sound that seemed to ease the tension in the air. "Then I guess I have no choice." As he rolled forward, Nora noticed the tremor in his left hand. Subtle, but not the old nervous kind, this one was different. A deep, involuntary shudder that made his coffee spill slightly on the rim of his cup. Her medical instincts sharpened. "Malcolm, when did that start?" He tried to smile it away. "This morning. Probably nerves." But she saw through it. There was something wrong, something he wasn't telling anyone. The ceremony began. The hospital director spoke about service, legacy, compassion, words that sounded rehearsed but felt empty compared to the silence in Malcolm's eyes. When they called him to speak, he hesitated. The crowd began to clap, urging him forward. Nora watched him roll to the podium, his right hand steady, his left trembling against the armrest. He cleared his throat. The microphone picked up the faint shake in his breath. "I used to think legacy was made of buildings," he began. "Contracts. Numbers. Profits. I was wrong." Every camera lens turned toward him. "Legacy is what you leave behind in the hearts of people you once hurt," he said. "And if you're lucky, they'll let you rebuild what you broke." He looked at Nora then. "Not for approval. For truth. This wing isn't charity. It's confession. Every brick here is an apology that learned how to stand." The audience fell silent. Some wept quietly. Malcolm continued, his voice gaining strength even as his hands weakened. "A man once told me healing doesn't erase pain, it teaches it where to go. I think I finally understand." He reached for the ribbon-cutting scissors. His hand trembled so badly he couldn't hold them steady. The moment stretched painfully long. The camera zoomed in. The crowd shifted uncomfortably. Nora stepped forward before anyone else could move. She placed her hand gently over his. "It's okay," she whispered. "We'll cut it together." He looked at her, eyes bright with unshed tears. Then he nodded. Together, they cut the ribbon, his weakness met by her steadiness. The crowd erupted in applause, but neither of them heard it. For that brief moment, they existed in a space between ruin and grace. Afterward, as people surrounded them, Malcolm excused himself. Nora followed, catching him near the service elevator, his breath shallow. "Malcolm," she said firmly, "you're shaking worse than before. You need to be checked." He shook his head. "I've been checked." Her stomach dropped. "And?" He hesitated. "Parkinson's. Early stage." The words landed like a quiet bomb. "How long have you known?" 2 months, he said softly. "I didn't want it to be another reason for people to pity me." Her throat closed. "You should have told me." He gave a faint smile. "Would it have changed anything?" "Yes," she said. "I'd have been here sooner." He looked away, blinking hard. "Nora, everything I've done, the letters, the wing, it's not to look noble. It's because I needed to do something good while I still can." She stepped closer. "You're not dying." "No," he said. "Just running out of time to move like the man I used to be." The elevator doors opened. He didn't step in. Instead, he looked back at her, expression raw. "When I met you, I thought I was cursed. Now I think maybe the curse was never feeling enough. You changed that." Nora's voice cracked. Then don't stop feeling now. He smiled weakly. That's the problem, Nora. I can't stop. The doors closed before she could answer. She stood there, watching her reflection in the mirrored elevator door until it showed only her own tears. Back outside, Sky ran toward her, waving a brochure from the new wing. Mommy. They put Daddy's name on the wall. Mr. Malcolm said it's forever. Nora knelt, hugging her tightly. Her heart ached, torn between gratitude and fear. Yes, baby, she whispered. Forever. But as she said it, she looked toward the hallway Malcolm had disappeared into, and she knew, forever might not be as long as she wanted it to be. That night, Nora found another envelope slipped under her office door. Her name. His handwriting. If my hands fail before my heart does, promise me something. Keep the wing alive. Keep the kindness louder than the applause. M. She held the note to her chest, tears falling silently. For the first time, she wasn't angry at him. She was terrified for him. And somewhere in that fear, love began to take its first fragile breath. The night after the unveiling, the hospital hummed like a living thing, machines breathing, monitors blinking, lives mending. Nora stayed long after her shift ended, walking the quiet halls of the new Ellis wing. The paint still smelled fresh, the lights too bright, but the air carried something gentler now. Her husband's name shimmered in gold on the entrance wall. She traced it with her fingers, whispering something only the wall would hear. It wasn't goodbye. It was thank you. When she turned to leave, she saw him again, Malcolm, half-shadowed under the corridor light. He shouldn't have been there. Visiting hours were over, and the exhaustion on his face looked worse than before. Malcolm, she said, startled. You shouldn't be walking alone this late. I couldn't sleep, he murmured. Thought I'd see how it all looks at night. She moved closer. His hands were trembling again. More violently now. You need to sit. He smiled faintly. You sound like every nurse I've ever ignored. I'm not asking, she said, guiding him into the lounge. The tremor wouldn't stop. His knuckles quivered against the armrest. She pressed the emergency call button without a word. Within minutes, a resident rushed in. The room filled with low voices, quiet urgency. Blood pressures dropping. Heart rates unstable. Get him to observation. Malcolm's eyes met hers through the haze. Don't make a scene. Too late, she said, voice trembling. You made one the moment you decided to pretend you were fine. He tried to chuckle, but his chest hitched instead. They wheeled him out, the sound of rubber wheels echoing down the sterile corridor like thunder rolling through guilt. He spent the night in a private room under soft light, monitors blinking rhythmically beside him. Nora refused to leave. She sat by the bed, arms folded, heart beating too loud. When he woke hours later, he found her slumped forward, asleep in the visitor's chair, her hand still on his blanket as if anchoring him to this world. He whispered her name once, afraid it might break her rest. She stirred, blinked, then exhaled in relief. You scared me, she said quietly. He smiled weakly. I scare everyone eventually. Not Sky, she said. He laughed softly. She's braver than all of us. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was human. A pause that allowed fear to breathe without shame. How bad is it? She finally asked. He looked at his hands. Progressing. Slowly, they said. Fast enough that I feel it. Medication? Helps a little. But I've been pushing too hard. You think? She said, half angry, half heartbroken. He turned toward her. I didn't want you to see me like this. Weak. Fragile. Her voice softened. Malcolm, strength isn't standing tall. Sometimes it's just staying. He closed his eyes, letting her words settle where guilt had lived too long. After a moment, she reached into her pocket and pulled out something small, a folded napkin. The one Sky had drawn on months ago. 3 figures under the sun. She made me promise to give this back to you, Nora said. Said it wasn't finished yet. He unfolded it carefully, his hands shaking less now. Someone had added new colors, blue sky, golden rays, a bridge connecting the figures. She said the bridge means you can come home, Nora whispered. Malcolm's throat tightened. And where is home, Nora? She looked at him for a long moment. Where people still believe in you. He didn't respond. He couldn't. Words were too small for what was happening inside him. Days passed. His condition stabilized, but he wasn't the same. The hospital room became a quiet confessional. Doctors came and went, but Nora stayed. Sometimes she read out loud from old books. Sometimes she just sat and let the silence work its medicine. Sky visited after school, bringing laughter and crayons. She made him promise that when his hands got better, he'd draw something himself. He smiled and said he would, even though both of them knew he might never hold a pencil steady again. Late one evening, as the city dimmed outside the window, Nora found him awake, staring at the monitors. Still awake? She asked. I keep thinking about time, he said. How it steals, how it gives. She sat beside him. You've already given more back than most people ever do. He looked at her. Then why does it still feel like I owe more? Because good men never stop owing, she said softly. They just learn to pay with kindness instead of money. He smiled faintly. You make redemption sound simple. It's not, she said. But you're doing it right. He exhaled, closing his eyes. If this were my last night, I'd want it to look exactly like this. She froze, heart aching. Don't say that. He opened his eyes, meeting hers. Then tell me something worth staying for. She hesitated, then whispered, Sky still wants you to teach her chess. He smiled, the smallest but most honest one she'd seen. Then I guess I'll stay. When morning came, the doctor entered with new charts and quiet optimism. Malcolm's vitals were improving. The tremors had eased. Nora watched him sign a release form slowly, deliberately, one careful stroke at a time. When he finished, she said, You should rest at home. He nodded. Only if you promise to visit. She tried to hide her smile. You don't give up, do you? He looked up at her. Not when it finally matters. That afternoon, as she walked him to the hospital doors, the sun returned, warm, gold, alive. The same sun from Sky's drawing. He paused at the threshold, glancing at the engraved letters on the wall, Ellis Rehabilitation Wing. You gave me my name back, she said quietly. He shook his head. You gave me mine first. Nora's eyes glistened. Take care of yourself, Malcolm. He nodded, rolling forward slowly into the light. The doors opened automatically, as if recognizing a man who no longer needed permission to begin again. And for the first time, the billionaire who had lost everything didn't look like a man escaping his past. He looked like someone walking toward his future. Spring crept in quietly, the way healing often does. The city thawed, the hospital windows opened for the first time in months, and somewhere in the rhythm of ordinary days, Malcolm began to look alive again. He spent his mornings in therapy, his afternoons reading to Sky in the hospital garden. The tremors hadn't vanished, but he'd learned to move with them, not against them. Every shake of his hand reminded him that control was overrated. Presence was enough. Sky adored him. She'd wheel her tiny pink bike beside his chair, chattering about school and her dreams. When I grow up, she said once, I want to fix people too. Malcolm smiled. Like your mother? She shook her head. Like you. You fix hearts, not bodies. That line hit him harder than any boardroom insult ever had. He carried it with him like a small light that refused to go out. Nora watched them sometimes from the hospital window. It scared her. How natural he looked there, how her daughter's laughter sounded fuller with him around. But fear, she'd learned, often travels with love. One evening, as the sky bruised purple and gold, she joined them in the garden. Sky had fallen asleep in the grass beside Malcolm's chair, head resting on his coat. Nora sat quietly beside them. She talks about you all the time. I've noticed, he said softly. She keeps me accountable. You like being here, don't you? He nodded. It's the only place I don't feel like I owe anyone. She glanced at him. You don't owe me either. He met her eyes. Then why does it feel like I still do? She didn't answer. Some debts are too human to measure. 3 days later, the call came. His assistant's voice trembled with a mix of excitement and fear. Sir, the board voted unanimously. They want you back, full reinstatement. CEO. Effective immediately. The words landed like thunder in a quiet church. He sat in silence, staring at his reflection in the hospital window. The skyline shimmered in the glass, a life waiting to be reclaimed. The power, the control, the endless noise. You've been rehabilitated, his assistant continued. Investors see you as a symbol now. The comeback story. We can rebuild everything you lost. He ended the call without replying. Rebuild everything he lost. The phrase lingered like smoke. But what if what he'd lost wasn't worth finding again? That evening, he told Nora. She froze mid-step. They want you back. He nodded. All of it. The company. The seat. The noise. Her tone sharpened. And what do you want? He hesitated. I don't know. She crossed her arms. Yes, you do. You just don't like the answer. He looked at her. You think I should stay here? Teaching kids chess in hospital gardens? I think peace doesn't always look impressive, she said. He sighed. You sound like you've already made up your mind for me. She stepped closer. No, Malcolm. I just don't want to watch you climb back into a life that almost killed you. Her voice cracked on the last word. He stared at her, the silence between them pulsing with unspoken things. Finally, he said, you don't believe I can balance both? She swallowed. I believe people go back to what breaks them if it still applauds. The words cut deep, not because they were cruel, but because they were true. That night, he didn't sleep. The city lights blinked outside his window like the world whispering, come home. He thought of Sky's drawing, the bridge, the sun, the 3 figures. If he returned to that empire, would the bridge collapse again? At dawn, he wheeled into the empty hospital corridor. The Ellis wing glowed faintly in the early light. He rolled toward the wall where her husband's name was engraved. He rested his palm against the letters. You built this place, he whispered. I just signed the checks. Tell me. What would you have done? He waited, half expecting silence. But something stirred inside him, an answer not in words, but in weight. The kind that humbles. He turned toward the door. By noon, Nora found him sitting in the cafeteria, coffee in hand, face unreadable. You've made your choice, she said quietly. He nodded. I turned them down. Her breath caught. You what? I told them to appoint someone else. Someone younger. Someone who still believes profit is purpose. She stared at him. Malcolm, that company was your life. He smiled faintly. No. It was my distraction. This, he gestured around them, to the nurses rushing past, to the hum of healing all around, this feels more alive than anything I ever built. Nora's voice softened. You're really letting it go. He nodded. It's strange. The more I lose, the lighter I feel. She sat beside him. That's how grief turns into grace. He looked at her. You make it sound poetic. It is, she said. You're rewriting a story most men would never dare to edit. They sat there, two people who had lost too much and still managed to find something worth keeping. Outside, the hospital garden swayed under the afternoon wind. Sky ran through the grass, laughing, holding a paper plane in both hands. It dipped, rose, spun. Malcolm watched her and whispered, almost to himself, maybe this is what wealth feels like. Nora smiled. Maybe it always was. That night, as he lay in bed, a text from his former assistant appeared on his phone. Sir, the board is furious. They said you're throwing everything away. Malcolm typed back slowly, his hand trembling just enough to blur the screen. You can't throw away what never truly belonged to you. He turned off the phone, closed his eyes, and listened to the city's heartbeat through his open window. He had made his choice. He'd walked away from the throne and into something quieter. But infinitely more human. And for the first time since the crash, Malcolm K didn't feel like a man recovering. He felt like a man reborn. Peace rarely announces when it plans to leave. That evening began with ordinary kindness, the hum of laundry in Nora's apartment, the soft clink of dishes, Sky making paper crowns at the kitchen table. Malcolm had promised to stop by with a chessboard he'd found in a thrift shop, the kind with worn edges and a velvet-lined drawer, the kind that remembers gentle hands. He was late by 10 minutes, then 20, then 40. Nora told herself he was resting. She told herself the elevator was slow. She told herself nothing was wrong because nothing being wrong is a prayer disguised as logic. Her phone buzzed once. A short message. 2 words that felt like a siren. At lobby. She opened the door expecting apology and a smile. The smile wasn't there. His left shoulder leaned harder than usual against the chair arm. His jaw worked like a stubborn hinge. His eyes were clear, but the skin above them held the pale sheen of a man bracing against a wave. He tried to joke that the chessboard weighed more than it looked. The sentence broke in the middle. Silence finished it for him. Sky ran forward in her paper crown and stopped so fast the crown slid sideways. She saw it faster than anyone, the tiny refusal in his fingers, the way his breath measured time too carefully, the way brave people go quiet when pain tries to lie. Nora knelt by the chair and took his wrist like a promise. The pulse raced, then stuttered, then settled into a rhythm she didn't trust. She said they were going now. He said he didn't want the hospital. She said she wasn't asking. He nodded because arguing felt like betrayal of the person she believed he was. The elevator ride down tasted like metal. The city outside had that wet shine that makes pavement look like a mirror, and every reflected light looked like a warning. She drove with both hands hard on the wheel, the way widows drive when the night has already taken too much and they refuse to offer one more thing. Triage moved quickly because certain faces changed the speed of rooms. A tech clipped a lead. A nurse closed a curtain. A monitor decided whether it would be kind. Nora stood at the rail, steady, controlled, the calm storm people trust. She watched the tremor ripple shoulder to fingers. She watched his jaw unclench then tighten again. She watched a man she had learned to forgive begin to lose the ground forgiveness needs. He whispered that he was sorry for missing the crown ceremony. She said crowns are patient. He said he was tired of being the reason a room turned serious. She said a life can be serious and still be good. The resident arrived with the careful tone of someone trained to tell the truth without igniting panic. Not a stroke. Not a heart attack. An escalation. Autonomic mischief. A body learning a new language too fast. She understood immediately. Temperature dysregulation. Blood pressure drift. Medication biting at the edges of stability. Simple words for complex storms. Manageable. Dangerous. Both can be true. They started fluids. They adjusted the cocktail with the small courage of medicine. Numbers, then needles, then prayer in the quiet voice of science. Malcolm closed his eyes the way brave men do when they need to borrow strength from darkness. Nora pulled the curtain, turned the overheads down one click, and sat close enough for her sleeve to brush his blanket. She spoke like a metronome set to mercy. Breathe with me. In on 4. Out on 6. Again. The monitor softened its beeping the way babies soften a room. The tremor loosened its grip and sulked in the corner. His mouth found a line that resembled rest. She let herself feel the fear once it was safe to feel it. It rose from the floor and wrapped around her ribs, hot at first, then cold, then the steady ache of recognition. She had buried a husband. She would not bury a hope. Sky arrived with the chessboard, clutching it like a relic, escorted by a nurse who understood that rules are guidelines when a child is carrying courage. She whispered that the king doesn't move fast but still matters most. He smiled with his eyes because the rest of his face wasn't ready. She placed the pawn in his hand and waited to see if the world would let him keep it. His fingers shook, then settled enough to cradle the smallest piece on the board. It was a sermon without words. Hours folded. The worst passed. Stability is rarely dramatic. It arrives like a coat around shoulders. The resident returned with a plan written in sensible ink. Titrate here. Reduce there. Sleep more. Pretend less. Malcolm listened the way men listen when they've finally decided to live. He agreed to home monitoring, to PT resequencing, to a schedule that respected the limits his heart had been shouting over. He promised to call before he fell apart next time. He promised to let people see him before the cliff. Nora asked for specifics because love is detail. She wrote them down in the brisk handwriting of someone who has turned chaos into calendars for a living. She asked about the tremor pattern. She asked about early warning signs. She asked about the nights, because nights do most of the damage. The resident answered with the respect reserved for women who speak softly and save lives daily. When they were alone again, he said he was embarrassed. She said embarrassment is pride's last defense and they were done with defenses. He said he hated being watched. She said he wasn't being watched, he was being kept. The curtain lifted a fraction. A light from the hallway spilled a gentle stripe across his blanket, like daylight remembering its way back. He asked what scared her most. She said slowness never scared her, vanishing did. He said he could give her slow. She said then he could stay. Sky had fallen asleep on 2 chairs pushed together, paper crown crooked, chessboard under her arm like a loyal dog. Nora tucked the crown straight and kissed the spot of forehead that still smelled like crayons. She returned to the bedside and rested her head near Malcolm's shoulder. The machine sighed. He breathed with it. The room found a rhythm that didn't hurt. Near dawn, the unit quieted in that sacred way hospitals do when night admits it has lost. The resident cleared them for transfer to observation, then discharge if stability behaved. Nora signed where signatures keep mercy legal. Malcolm watched her write his safety into the morning. He said he didn't want to be her burden. She said he wasn't, he was her choice. He said choices scared him more than diseases. She said love is a choice repeated until it looks like peace. The sun climbed the outer wall one window at a time. The Ellis wing letters caught fire and held it. An orderly wheeled him past the name that used to feel like a gravestone and now felt like a vow. In the lobby, the flowers from the unveiling had begun to fade at the edges. Nora paused to pluck the browned petals and leave what was still bright. She told him, that's how you live with fear, you keep what's strong and you let what's finished fall away. He nodded because truth rarely needs more than that. They reached the doors that breathe open for the morning shift. He looked at the street and then back at her and then down at the pawn still warm in his palm. He asked if she would come by later and make the apartment loud. She said she would if he promised to let the quiet rest in the corners. He agreed because bargains like that are how homes begin. Sky woke at the exact moment the automatic doors parted. She lifted the chessboard and announced that today the king would learn to castle. Malcolm laughed in a way that made nurses look up and smile without knowing why. Nora threaded her arm through the push bar and guided them into the thin gold of first light. Behind them, the monitors returned to their ordinary music. Ahead of them, a city remembered how to hold its own. He had almost disappeared. He hadn't. She had almost locked her heart again. She didn't. And as the doors closed softly on the night that tried to take him back, the morning stepped in and took its place. Morning arrived with the soft bravado of a second chance. The city breathed in steam and bus brakes and bakery air, and somewhere inside that ordinary symphony, Malcolm decided he was done negotiating with fear. He kept the hospital band on his wrist all day. Not as a warning, as a vow. A thin loop of plastic that said, "You were kept. You will keep others." Nora made the apartment bright the way caretakers do, opening curtains, setting out water, picking up quiet messes no one else sees. Sky built a chessboard kingdom on the coffee table and announced that the king's first law was naps after lunch. Malcolm signed the decree with a smile he hadn't worn since his legs still trusted stairs. They moved differently now. Not around each other, toward. Her hands reached for things before he dropped them. His voice reached for honesty before pride could edit. By noon, he was steady enough to tease. He asked if her paper crowns came in adult sizes. She said they did, but only for people who show up when nights break. He lifted the pawn like a toast. She nodded because some oaths don't need wine. The doorbell interrupted the peace with businesslike certainty. A courier in a navy jacket held out a thick envelope and a tablet. "Signature, sir." He unfolded the paperwork slowly, reading each line like a man towing a river before stepping in. Clinical evaluation. Movement disorder consultation. Pre-surgical candidacy. 3 words on a single page pulled the air thin, deep brain stimulation. Nora read beside him, nurse brain clicking into gear even as her heart braced. It wasn't a cure. It was a choice. Electric hope threaded through risk. A line into the brain. A line between now and later. Sky watched their faces the way children read weather. Is it a bad thing? Nora crouched to her level. It's a brave thing. Brave is allowed to be scary. Malcolm asked the only question that mattered. Will I still sound like myself? Nora answered the only way truth can. Maybe softer for a while. Maybe steadier. Maybe changed. Maybe better. He nodded as if the word maybe had finally learned how to carry kindness. By evening, fear had become pragmatic. She made a list. He made a call. The specialist at the Ellis wing picked up on the second ring because privilege answers faster when humility dials it. They offered an evaluation in 48 hours. He took it without pretending to be casual. That night, sleep came in rooms. Sky's room dreamed of castles and courageous kings. Nora's room kept one eye open because mothers don't fully close both. Malcolm's room held the sound of the ocean he played from his phone, tiny waves pretending they knew how to wash away worry. He woke twice. The first time to thirst. The second to a thought that refused to leave. He had a life to hand to other hands if his faltered. He had a company, and now, a wing, and now, a child's trust. He had no will on file that said what love should do if the room turned against them. At dawn, he rolled his chair to the kitchen table and wrote letters in real ink. One to the board, transfer of remaining voting power to the foundation. One to the hospital. Funding guarantees that ignored markets and respected dignity. One to Sky, 5 lines about pawns, courage, and why slow moves win games nobody watches. He left that one on the chessboard, tucked beneath the queen. Nora read the other letters while the kettle sang. Her eyes hardened the way strong eyes do when faced with tenderness disguised as exit strategy. "You're not going anywhere," she said. "I'm only making sure you don't have to carry 2 worlds if I wobble," he replied. She rested her hand on the paper, then on his shoulder, then on the stubborn question in his eyes. "We carry until it becomes we," she said. He breathed differently after that sentence. Like a man who had been promoted from singular to plural. The evaluation day came dressed like any other, which felt rude and merciful at once. Hospitals look kinder when they know your name. The Ellis wing did. The receptionist slid forms across the counter with the smile people save for family who has earned it. Tests began. Finger taps that felt like auditions. Lines to copy that turned into confessionals. Words to repeat that made language feel like a hallway with too many doors. He did well enough to hate doing them. He did poorly enough to want help. The neurologist spoke with the calm of someone who had watched storms and learned which winds mattered. "You're a candidate," he said. "Benefits are likely. Complications are possible. Timing is wisdom here. Soon is not a rush. Waiting is not surrender." Malcolm glanced at Nora. Her gaze carried the whole equation: mother, widow, nurse, woman who had found a reason to hope and a reason to be careful. She asked about the mapping. She asked about speech. She asked about tremor asymmetry and nocturnal patterns because love pays attention after midnight. The doctor answered thoroughly and without theater. This was not a miracle. This was a craft. They left with a packet and a date that was still a pencil mark. They left with a promise that asked for courage every morning until then. Outside, spring pushed through the edges of cold with small, brave green. Sky skipped between cracks in the sidewalk as if the city were a game that rewarded light feet. She asked if the surgery would make him run. He said he'd settle for stirring tea without spilling it. She said that sounded like a kind of sprint. At home, the day folded neatly around ordinary tasks. He practiced buttoning a shirt with patience that would have embarrassed his former self. She practiced letting someone else be helped by her without calling it debt. Sky practiced empathy like a language she had always been fluent in. Dinner was soup because soup comforts without announcing itself. They ate slower than grown-ups and faster than fear. He told a story about childhood rain and busted gutters. She told a story about a high school choir robe 3 sizes too big. The laughter didn't erase anything. It set the table for what courage would need later. After dishes, the apartment shifted into twilight quiet. Nora gathered the meds into a tidy row that made chaos behave. Malcolm placed the hospital band in the drawer, then took it back out and looped it around the lamp. "Light should remember why it's on," he said. She didn't argue. Some symbols are allowed to stay. When Sky fell asleep with the chessboard still open, they stood in the doorway and watched the small rise and fall that makes adults want to do impossible things. Nora spoke first. "I don't love you because you're brave. I love you because you're honest about when you're not." The word surprised both of them with how easily they fit in the room. He answered like a man who had run out of places to hide. "Then I'll keep telling the truth even when it scares me." "Start now," she said. "I'm afraid of forgetting the man I am if wires start helping," he said. She shook her head. "Wires don't make men. Promises do." He looked at the lamp with the hospital band halo and understood something simple. He wasn't being asked to become someone else. He was being asked to remain himself on harder settings. Before sleep, he wrote one more thing, 2 sentences on the margin of the consent packet. If my voice changes, let my choices speak for me. If my hands fail, let my keeping remain. Nora read it and slid the paper back without comment. Her eyes did the answering. We will remember you out loud. The apartment settled. The city softened. The night took its place without trying to steal anything. On the coffee table, the pawn stood at the center square like a small lighthouse in a quiet sea. It had no power on its own. It had purpose because 2 larger hands had decided it mattered. He slept. She listened. Sky dreamed of a king who moved slow and still won. And when the dark tested the windows, it found them latched by something it couldn't measure, 3 lives held together by a promise that chose courage before it chose certainty. Morning slid in like forgiveness, slow and golden. Steam from the kettle curled into the window light, the city sounded half awake, the kind of hush that happens when everything fragile is holding its breath. Malcolm sat at the table tracing the edge of the consent form, the pawn standing guard beside his coffee. He wasn't afraid of surgery. He was afraid of what might vanish if the tremor disappeared, the humility that had finally taught him how to love small things. Nora watched him from the stove, reading the silence like a language she'd learned the hard way. You're thinking too loud, she said. He smiled without lifting his eyes. I used to think silence was empty. Now it feels like a full room. Sky skipped in, still barefoot, crown sliding sideways. She plopped a paper envelope onto the table. For after the operation, she said. Inside was a single folded note in purple crayon, when you wake up, I'll teach you to move again. It undid him more efficiently than fear ever could. 2 days later, the hospital corridors smelled of antiseptic and courage. Malcolm had been through countless surgeries before the crash, but this felt different. This time, he wasn't fixing a broken body, he was testing a repaired soul. Nora stayed through prep, hands steady even when her throat wasn't. The surgeon explained the mapping process again, his voice and even rhythm meant to calm them both. Electrode leads thinner than forgiveness. Precision tighter than pride. The risk small but merciless if it decided otherwise. Malcolm looked up at Nora. If it doesn't work, promise me you'll keep the wing alive. She shook her head. If it doesn't work, we'll build another. He tried to laugh but it came out as breath. They rolled him toward the sterile theater. She followed until the red line on the floor told her no. He turned his head just enough to find her in the doorway. Stay where the light is, he said. She whispered back, bring some with you. Ours are strange inside waiting rooms, they stretch and collapse at the same time. Nora kept her hands busy, coffee, paperwork, silent prayers disguised as to-do lists. Sky drew another picture, 3 stick figures standing under a wire that sparkled like lightning. When she showed it to the nurse, the woman smiled. Looks like magic. It's electricity, Sky corrected. Magic you can explain. When the doors finally opened, the surgeon's face carried the quiet relief of a man who has wrestled with chaos and won by inches. The procedure went smoothly, he said. He's resting. Nora didn't wait for more. She moved like a pulse down the hallway, stopped only by the sound of machines greeting her with beeps that meant still here. Malcolm lay pale but breathing easily, the tremor barely visible. She took his hand and realized her own was shaking harder. Hours passed. He drifted between dreams and waking, his voice thin but certain. Did we win? She smiled through tears. We're on the board. Recovery was a lesson in patience. Every day, he relearned something the body once took for granted, buttons, pens, spoons, stairs. Every night, she relearned how to let hope stay without checking its expiration date. On the 7th morning, he managed to lift a full cup without spilling. Nora clapped once, quiet but proud. He held the cup mid-air and whispered, "It's not the coffee, it's control." She answered, "No. It's grace pretending to be control." Sky brought the chessboard again, setting pieces carefully. When Malcolm reached for the pawn, the tremor stayed still long enough for it to feel deliberate. He moved it forward one square. Sky gasped like she'd witnessed a miracle. "See," she said. "You still move slow, but you win." He laughed then, real laughter that startled the nurses. Nora closed her eyes and let it fill the room like sunlight spilling through blinds. Weeks folded into gentler routines. Therapy. Walks. Shared breakfasts that felt like prayers said backward. He spoke at the hospital's next fundraiser, voice steadier, words unpolished but alive. He said legacy wasn't marble or money, it was motion continued by hands that cared. People stood. Cameras flashed. But afterward, in the quiet of the corridor, he looked at Nora and said, "Applause feels smaller than her drawings." She nodded. "That's how you know it worked." That night, they went home together for the first time without fear, sitting in the back seat. The city lights followed them like curious stars. At the apartment, Sky waited on the couch wearing her crown and holding a sign that said "Welcome home, King of Patience." He read it twice before laughing so hard the tremor threatened to return. Nora leaned against the doorway watching them, her daughter's joy, his disbelief, the fragile miracle of survival becoming ordinary life. She thought of all the doors pain had closed and how this one, somehow, stayed open. When Sky fell asleep on the rug, Malcolm whispered, "You saved me twice, once with mercy, once with love." Nora shook her head. "No, Malcolm. You just finally let someone stay." He looked at the chessboard, the pawn still standing at center, and smiled. "This piece never meant much until she gave it to me." "It means everything now," Nora said. He nodded slowly, the lamplight catching the thin scar behind his ear, the silent signature of courage. Outside, the night wind pressed against the window but didn't get in. And for the first time in a long time, none of them were surviving. They were simply living. Summer arrived like a slow promise. The air smelled of pavement after rain, of cut grass, of second chances. The Ellis Wings courtyard had filled with color, roses, marigolds, the laughter of patients testing their new steps. Malcolm sat beneath the shade of a young oak tree, the chessboard open on his lap. His hands were still slower than before, but each move now had a certainty that machines could measure and hearts could feel. Across from him, Nora watched quietly, her eyes softer, her smile unguarded. Sky danced between the tables, chasing butterflies that refused to land. "You're steady today," Nora said. He looked at his hand as if surprised by its loyalty. Maybe the storms finally learned to listen. She tilted her head. "Or maybe you stopped fighting it." He chuckled. "Maybe that." The hospital courtyard had become their rhythm, coffee at 9, therapy at 10, life in every breath that used to hurt. But peace, as Malcolm knew too well, never stayed still. Later that week, a letter arrived. A foundation in Boston wanted him to chair an international board for neurological rehabilitation. It wasn't just a job, it was the world calling him back. Money. Fame. Speeches. The machine of purpose. He read it twice, then folded it once, cleanly, like a man tucking away temptation. When Nora found him that night sitting by the window, the city lights casting small constellations on the floor, she knew before he spoke. "They want you back," she said softly. "They think I've learned enough to teach again." Her voice was quiet but firm. "Have you?" He looked up at her. "I've learned that healing doesn't need an audience. But it's hard to ignore when the world knocks." She crossed the room and sat beside him. "Then ask yourself one question, does the knocking sound like calling, or like applause? He stared at the skyline for a long time. Once, applause had been oxygen. Now it felt like noise. 2 days later, he took Nora and Sky to the ocean. No cameras. No press. Just wind and the long memory of tides. Sky built castles that leaned toward the waves, daring them to try. Nora walked barefoot in the shallows, her scrubs replaced by sunlight and peace. Malcolm sat at the edge, sand creeping over his wheels, feeling the pulse of water meeting shore. The horizon looked like freedom dressed in blue. "Do you miss it?" Nora asked. He didn't answer at first. The question wasn't about the company, it was about the man he used to be. Finally, he said, "I miss thinking I was irreplaceable." She smiled sadly. "We all do. Until love proves us wrong." He looked at her, the salt air between them heavy with truth. "I don't deserve how you look at me." "You earned it," she said. "Not by being perfect, but by staying." That night, back in the apartment, Sky fell asleep before dinner, sea salt still in her hair. Malcolm and Nora sat by the open window, the sound of waves still echoing in their bones. He pulled a folded sheet from his pocket, the Boston offer. He handed it to her. "Read it." She did. Carefully. Quietly. When she finished, he said, "If I go, it means more research, more progress for people like me. But if I stay, you keep building lives, not systems," she finished for him. He nodded. "What would you do?" She looked at the sleeping child on the couch. "I'd ask what story I want her to tell about me one day. The man who healed the world, or the man who stayed for the people who made his world worth healing?" He smiled. "That's not fair." "Neither is love," she said. "But it's always honest." He looked down at the paper again. The ink shimmered faintly under the lamplight, full of promise and pressure. Then, with slow precision, he tore it in half. The sound was small. The relief was enormous. Nora exhaled, not realizing she'd been holding her breath. "You just turned down the world," she whispered. He smiled softly. "The world can wait. I'm already home." Weeks passed, and with them, his strength grew. The tremor still visited like an uninvited guest, but it no longer ruled the room. He began teaching small classes in the rehab wing. Patients learning resilience from a man who had failed his way into wisdom. Nora watched from the door sometimes, heart swelling quietly. He'd gesture with his hands, steady or not, and every eye in the room would follow. He wasn't their CEO. He was their mirror. One afternoon, after class, he found Sky waiting with a folder she'd made from colored paper. Inside was a child's version of a blueprint, stick figures, arrows, hearts, and words that didn't quite spell right. "Mr. Malcolm," she said proudly, "this is our next building. It's called the Kindness House. Everyone who feels sad can live there until they don't." He knelt as much as his chair allowed, eyes wet. "Who drew this?" "Me and Mommy," she said. "But you're the builder." He closed his eyes. The world's noise finally quieted into one small, sacred truth. He didn't need to fix everything. He just needed to keep this small paper kingdom made of second chances. Nora watched them, sunlight painting both their faces gold. In that fragile, fleeting moment, everything broken had found its place. And for the first time since his fall, Malcolm K didn't just believe in redemption, he lived inside it. They opened the doors on a Saturday morning that smelled like rain made of laundry soap. Hand-painted signs leaned against potted ferns, "Welcome home, you're safe here, coffee first," letters imperfect in the way truth is. Sky stood on the front step of the newly painted brick, her paper crown swapped for a hard hat 3 sizes too big. Across the street, neighbors gathered with folding chairs and cautious hope, the kind that waits to see if a promise will actually turn a key. They had named it exactly as a child would, the Kindness House. Not a shelter. Not a facility. A house. A place for people who had fallen between systems to land somewhere soft and be reminded that dignity is not something you earn. It's something you keep. Malcolm wore a navy sweater, sleeves pushed to his forearms, the scar behind his ear hidden beneath hair that had finally grown back enough to be careless. His hands moved slower than nerves, steadier than fear. Nora moved beside him with a clipboard and a quiet smile that made volunteers straighten without knowing why. The ribbon was not velvet. It was grocery store twine, dyed gold by Sky and 3 little girls from the block. When it was time, Malcolm held the twine with 2 fingers and looked at the door like a man making a vow out loud. "We don't cut kindness," he said softly. "We open it." He lifted the latch. The crowd clapped because relief can sound like thunder. Inside smelled of fresh paint and cinnamon. A long table held mismatched mugs and a cake that had listed to one side in the oven and somehow looked perfect for it. Rooms had lamps instead of overhead glare. Every bed had a quilt stitched by hands that understood December. There was a small bookshelf in the entry labeled Leave 1, Take 2. Someone had tucked a Bible between a mystery novel and a paperback about birds. Faith in guessing and flight, everything they were trying to practice here. Sky tugged Malcolm toward a corner where a corkboard waited. "Wall of Winds," she announced. "When someone sleeps all night or keeps a job or says sorry or eats breakfast, we pin it." He laughed under his breath. "Then we'll need more thumbtacks." Nora looked at him and thought, I have never seen a man look more like home. Volunteers fanned out, plumbers discussing pipes, a teacher sorting donated notebooks, 2 grandmothers arguing with love about where the extra blankets belonged. The house hummed with a kind of gentle work that felt like prayer with sleeves rolled. In the back hallway, beneath the staircase, a narrow door stuck on its hinge. "Storage," Nora said, leaning her shoulder into it until it gave. A breath of cool air slid out, carrying the faint smell of sawdust and something older, paper that had waited. The closet held boxes with years stamped on the sides, a bundle of rolled blueprints bound with twine, and an old metal file drawer with a stubborn handle. Sky pointed. "Treasure." Malcolm smiled. "Archaeology." Nora crouched and tugged the drawer. It slid open with a sigh that sounded like relief arriving late. Inside, intake forms from a clinic that had stood here before the city lost its patience, a Polaroid of a pastor handing out scarves, a stack of envelopes addressed but never sent. At the very back, wrapped in brown paper and tied with hospital tape, lay a long cardboard tube. On the tape, a name in block letters, Ellis. Nora froze without meaning to. Her fingers went tender, the way hands do when they recognize a relic. She loosened the tape and eased the paper free. The tube rattled softly. Blueprints inside, and something that sounded like an envelope sliding. She eased the roll open onto the floor. Out dropped her husband's hand-drawn plan, the early version of the rehab wing, penciled notes in the margins, careful, hopeful, dog-eared by years of refusal. A second page, a sketch labeled Kindness Annex, residential, 6 rooms, shared kitchen, porch light on a timer. At the bottom, in his neat engineer's print, build where the city forgets its own. An envelope had been taped to the back. No stamp. No address. Just a single line in ink she knew better than her own, for MK, deliver if he ever comes back. The floor tilted. Air thinned. She sat without choosing to. Malcolm hovered, unsure. "Nora?" Her voice arrived as a whisper. "It's from him." She slid a finger beneath the flap and pulled out 2 sheets. The first was dated 3 weeks after the crash that had broken the life she used to have and knocked a stranger's into pieces. Firehouse Station 27 letterhead. "Mr. Cade. You won't know me. You were unconscious when we cut the door. I was the one who held your head still while the medic kept saying, stay, like the word could fence death out. I've read the papers since. The jokes. The names they've given you. People have short memories for mercy. I can't fix your body. But if you wake up and remember this letter, build the house my wife and I keep sketching on our kitchen table. Somewhere warm with doors that won't ask questions. The city doesn't need more towers. It needs a porch light that doesn't go out. If you don't make it, I'll build it without you. If I don't make it, you build it for me. R. Ellis. The room stilled until even dust listened. Nora pressed the second page flat with trembling palms. It wasn't addressed to Malcolm. It was addressed to her. N. If this note finds you, it means fate did its torn paper trick again. I tucked both letters into the plans because I learned something at 2 a.m. on the side of Highway 6, we live inside each other's second chances. If he wakes, help him remember that power has a pulse and it's called people. If I don't come home one day, tell our girl that love stays. Build the house. The words blurred. She didn't wipe her eyes. She let the grief finish what it started the day the siren never shut off. Malcolm knelt as far as the chair allowed, hands on the blueprint like a man steadying an altar. When did he write this? The week after he pulled you from the car, she said, the sentence assembling itself from terror and awe. Something luminous moved across Malcolm's face, shock, then gratitude so deep it looked like ache. All this time, he whispered, I thought chance brought me to your table. He did. She looked at him, and the years between loss and this morning collapsed into a single doorway with both of them on the threshold. He did, she said. He set a light for us, and we just kept walking until we saw it. They sat on the floor with the plan spread between them. Sky crawled into the triangle of their knees, resting her cheek on the paper. Is this Daddy's? Nora nodded. He drew it for people who needed rest. Sky traced the sketch of the porch with one finger. We made it real. In the front room, a kettle clicked off. Somebody laughed near the big window. A volunteer asked where to put a bin of new socks. Life didn't pause for miracles, it folded them in. Nora folded the letters back into their envelope and pressed it into Malcolm's hands. These belong to you. He shook his head. They belong to all three of us. He wheeled to the living room and tapped a nail into the wall by the entry table, just above the bowl where strangers would leave keys they didn't want to lose again. He slid the envelope onto the nail like a small frame. Let the house know who built it, he said. Let everyone read why the porch light stays on. By afternoon, the Kindness House had its first residents. An exhausted grandmother with a grandson who slept like a question, a night shift janitor waiting on a paycheck that always showed up late, a woman with a suitcase and a laugh that sounded like it remembered music. They ate soup. They argued over whether the couch should face the window or the TV. They pinned their first victories to the corkboard, took my meds, called my sister, slept through. At dusk, the porch light clicked on. It threw a warm circle onto the steps and reached across the sidewalk like a hand. Inside that circle, the three of them stood, widow, builder, child, held together by a letter that had waited in the dark until someone loved it into the light. Nora rested her head against Malcolm's shoulder. Do you hear it? She asked. What? The sound of a promise keeping itself. He listened. He heard the kettle, the hum of the refrigerator, the low thunder of buses turning the corner, the porch bulb buzzing its small vow. He heard a firefighter's handwriting, finally spoken out loud. I hear it, he said. Sky tugged at his sleeve. Come on, Mr. Malcolm. The first bedtime story in the Kindness House has to be about heroes. He smiled. I know exactly which one. They walked down the hall, past the framed envelope, past the blueprint tacked beside it, into a room where a lamp was already doing what it was built to do. And as the door eased shut, the light stayed, on the porch, on the plans, on the faces of people who had fallen and found somewhere soft to land, because a man who once saved a stranger had asked the future to finish what courage began. Winter leaned over the city again, but this year the cold felt different. Gentler, like something that came to watch rather than take. The Kindness House glowed at the end of the block, its porch light steady against the wind, its windows breathing warmth into the night. Inside, the world had rearranged itself into something that worked, laughter in the kitchen, soup simmering in borrowed pots, and a little girl sitting cross-legged on the floor drawing her family exactly as it had become. Malcolm watched from his wheelchair by the fire, a blanket tucked over his knees, fingers tracing the edge of his coffee cup like it was a pulse. He had been many things, CEO, patient, symbol, but this quiet guardian of a house that refused to sleep on suffering, was the first role that fit without pain. Nora moved through the room collecting plates and soft thank yous. Her hair was loose now, streaked with silver that caught the light like threads of earned grace. Every movement she made told the truth, she was no longer surviving. She was living the life that once existed only in her late husband's blueprints. Skye ran toward Malcolm, holding her latest creation, a paper ornament cut into the shape of a heart with uneven edges. "It's for the tree," she said proudly. He took it, pretending to examine it like a jeweler appraising gold. "It's not perfect," she said. He smiled. "Neither is this house. That's how we know it's real." The holidays came quietly. Neighbors who once crossed the street to avoid the old building now came carrying casseroles, scarves, books, and stories. The front porch filled with shoes that didn't match and laughter that did. On Christmas Eve, Nora found Malcolm in the office, staring at a folder labeled Ellis Foundation Annual Report. It wasn't his idea, it was the city's. They wanted to expand the model, replicate the Kindness House in 5 new neighborhoods. His name would be on the documents, his face in the newspapers again. He looked up when she entered. "Tell me," he said, "how do we grow without losing what made it small and sacred?" She thought for a moment. "By keeping one rule," she said. "No matter how far it spreads, every door must still open with a hand, not a keycard." He nodded. "Then let's build more doors." Later, as midnight rolled quietly across the street outside, they gathered around the tree Skye had decorated with paper stars. Each star carried a name written in crayon, people who had stayed here, healed here, laughed here. Nora read them softly. Evelyn walked again. Cal called his brother. Martha slept a full night. Each name was a victory disguised as an ordinary act. Each name proof that light was winning, one room at a time. Skye looked up at the highest branch, where a small folded note sat like a secret. "What's that one?" she asked. Malcolm hesitated, then reached for it. "It's the first name," he said. "The one that made all the others possible." He opened it. Inside, in fading ink, were the words, "For the man I helped from the car. For the life that saved mine. R. Ellis." Nora's breath caught. He looked at her, eyes damp but shining. "It's the letter's twin," he whispered. He must have kept one for himself. They didn't speak for a long while. The fire cracked, the wind softened, and the porch light hummed steady through the frost. Weeks later, the first new Kindness House opened across the river. It wasn't as grand. It didn't need to be. A single bulb glowed above the door, powered by a donated generator and a promise mailed from across town. Inside, a volunteer named Martha hung a frame by the entrance, the letter from R. Ellis, reprinted and shared. Below it, a quote from Malcolm. "If mercy has walls, it's only so we can paint them together." Time, which once punished, now became gentle. Spring pushed through cracks in the sidewalk. Skye started school, bringing home drawings of buildings with ramps, gardens, and smiling stick figures. Nora took over as director of the foundation, while Malcolm spent mornings mentoring patients who'd lost more than he ever did. One afternoon, he rolled out onto the porch and watched Sky teaching a new resident how to plant flowers. The man's hands trembled. Sky took them without hesitation. "It's okay," she said. "We plant slow here." Malcolm closed his eyes. That was it. That was everything his empire, his boardrooms, his speeches had missed. The world didn't need saving, it needed slowing. That night, Nora joined him on the porch. The street was quiet, just the low hum of traffic and the faint smell of jasmine. She set a candle between them. "For Robert," she said. "For Robert," he echoed. The flame flickered once, then steadied. "Do you ever think he knows?" she asked. Malcolm looked at the porch light. "He knows," he said. "You don't write a letter like that without believing the world listens." They sat there for a long time, two people who had been strangers and survivors and something braver in between. When dawn came, the city stretched awake to find the house still glowing, its light spilling onto the cracked sidewalk, its doors already opening for whoever needed to come in next. Inside, the chessboard waited, the pawn standing eternal in its place, a small piece that had moved the world forward. Malcolm whispered into the morning, not for anyone to hear but because some truths need sound to stay alive. We were never broken. We were just waiting for a gentler blueprint. The kettle clicked on. Sky's laughter broke the quiet. And outside, the sun rose on a world that, for once, didn't need fixing, just keeping. The kindness house stayed awake. And the light, as promised, never went out. The morning began like any other miracle pretending to be ordinary. Steam from the kettle. Bread toasting unevenly. Sky humming under her breath as she packed crayons into a tin box she called her idea chest. The kindness house breathed softly around them. Walls warm, pipes whispering, sunlight moving like water across the floorboards. Malcolm sat at the kitchen table, notebook open, pen steady in his hand. The tremor that once ruled his fingers now came only in echoes, small reminders that pain had a memory, but it didn't have power. Nora leaned against the counter, still in her robe, her eyes tracing him the way one studies something rare and familiar all at once. She said, "You're writing again." He smiled. "It's time. I owe a book to the people who stayed when I couldn't. What will you call it?" He looked at Sky drawing in the sunlight. "Maybe the house that taught me to walk without moving." Nora laughed softly. "Too long." "Then just kindness wins," he said. Short. Like forgiveness. Outside, the city had changed without asking permission. Bus stops once filled with silence now had flyers for the new kindness houses, 5, then 6, then 9 across the state. People came not to be saved but to belong. It had become a movement stitched from empathy instead of slogans. And every blueprint traced back to one hand-signed letter from a man who never got to see the foundation laid. Malcolm never let himself forget that. The letter still hung in the front hallway, framed in modest wood. Sometimes he'd pause beneath it, reading a single line before moving on. "If I don't come home one day, tell our girl that love stays." That promise had grown into rooms, jobs, laughter, and a kind of faith that didn't need a steeple. Late that afternoon, a black car pulled up outside. The logo on the door was the city seal. Two officials stepped out, one carrying a briefcase, the other holding a thin envelope. Nora met them at the porch. They smiled too politely, the kind of smile people use before they take something away. "Mrs. Ellis?" one asked. "We're here about the zoning renewal." Her heart skipped. "Renewal? We filed all documents last month." "Yes," the man said carefully, "but there's been a change. The property was never formally transferred from municipal reserve. There's a clause, an old one, that could reassign ownership if not appealed. Malcolm had joined her by then, silent, shoulders squared. The man continued, if unchallenged, this land reverts to the city within 60 days. The world dimmed a little. 60 days. The house that had saved hundreds. The porch that had carried prayers like footprints. All of it, suddenly paper again. That night, they didn't eat dinner. They sat by the fire, documents spread across the table. Skye slept upstairs, her drawings taped across the wall like declarations of joy. Nora read each line twice. They could bulldoze it, Malcolm. He stared at the flames. No. Not this. Not after everything. Her voice broke. It's legal. Not emotional. They don't care about letters or promises. He lifted his eyes, calm in the way cliffs are calm before wind. Then we'll remind them what they're trying to erase. The next morning, word spread before breakfast. Neighbors arrived with chairs, coffee, petitions. Former residents came, some walking with canes, others pushing strollers, all carrying gratitude like armor. By noon, the street was full. Reporters stood behind tripods. Someone hung a banner from the roof, "You can't evict kindness." Malcolm rolled to the front porch, Nora beside him, Skye perched on the rail holding her sign, crayon letters crooked and brave, "Home isn't paper." A reporter asked, "Mr. Cade, what happens if the appeal fails?" He didn't hesitate. "Then we build it again," he said. "On another street. In another city. You can close a building. You can't close what it teaches." The crowd roared, not like a protest, but like gratitude learning to shout. That evening, as the sun bled gold into the horizon, Malcolm sat in his office and drafted a letter addressed to the same city department that had sent theirs. He titled it "The Day We Remembered Who We Are." You can't measure mercy in square footage. You can't invoice healing or assess zoning on hope. If you visit this house, you'll see that its walls were built by grief that refused to stay silent and by love that refused to stay small. You want proof of ownership? Step inside. Every handprint on the banister, every thank you whispered in the hallway, every child's laughter echoing through the vents, that's your proof. He didn't sign it as CEO. He signed it as resident, survivor, father, friend. The city's decision came 3 weeks later. They called it a special exemption, but everyone knew what it really was, surrender to something holier than paperwork. The Kindness House was declared a permanent landmark. That night, Nora stood on the porch with Malcolm and Skye, the three of them wrapped in a blanket against the wind. Below them, the city flickered like 100 small candles. Nora whispered, "We almost lost it." Malcolm's eyes softened. "That's how we learn to keep it." Skye tugged at his sleeve. "Does this mean we're safe now?" He smiled. "Nothing is ever completely safe, kiddo. But kindness is the closest thing we have." Inside, the fire burned steady. A new plaque hung above the mantel. The Kindness House, founded by courage, kept by love. Malcolm looked around, the walls painted by strangers who had become family, the laughter of residents who once believed they had none left to give, Nora's tired but glowing eyes. He felt something click into place inside him, a soft, silent truth. The man who had once been abandoned at a café was no longer alone in the world. He had built something that stayed awake even when everyone slept. He whispered to himself, "Let them count their cities. We'll count our lights." Outside, the porch bulb hummed against the dark, steady as a vow. And from a second-floor window, a child's voice floated down, half prayer, half promise. "Good night, Mr. Malcolm. Don't forget to keep the light on." He looked up, smiling. "Always." And as snow began to fall, soft, slow, forgiving, the Kindness House glowed brighter, not fighting the darkness, but teaching it how to love the light. It began with wind. Not a storm, just that quiet kind, the kind that slips under doors and carries the smell of memory. The kindness house creaked softly, settling like an old heart that had decided to keep beating. Inside, morning brewed slowly. Malcolm woke before dawn, as he always did. The tremor had nearly faded, his hands obeyed now, though every movement still carried the reverence of someone who had once been betrayed by his own body. He rolled to the window, watching the first light touch the roofs across the street. It looked like mercy wearing gold. Downstairs, Nora was already in the kitchen. She never slept late anymore. Sleep, for her, was a country she visited briefly, then left before the border guards could ask why. She poured 2 cups of coffee, his black, hers with a trace of sugar, and said without turning, "You're up early." He smiled faintly. Old habits. Empires run on insomnia. She set the cups down. Not this one. This one runs on peace. He liked how she said that, quiet, like a prayer she didn't want to scare away. The kindness house was thriving. More houses had opened, 10 now, stretching like a constellation across the map. People wrote letters from cities Malcolm had never seen, saying they'd found a place to sit, to eat, to breathe. He kept them all in a box labeled proof that it worked. But on this particular morning, something else arrived. An email from a filmmaker. A woman named Isla Torres, who had once been one of their earliest residents. She wanted to make a documentary about the house. Not about me, Malcolm said aloud, scanning the screen. About us. Nora read over his shoulder. It's time people know what kindness looks like, she said. He hesitated. Fame had broken him once, he didn't know if he could carry its light again. Let's show them the truth, she whispered. Not the billionaire. The man who learned to stay. Filming began the next week. Cameras moved gently through the rooms, never intruding, just observing. They filmed the residents cooking, laughing, rebuilding. They filmed Nora bandaging an elderly woman's hand, Sky teaching a teenage boy to read, Malcolm fixing a hinge on the back door. The crew asked questions, but the answers came in small gestures, a shared smile, a held hand, a silence that said everything. Isla's camera lingered on the letter framed in the hallway. Who wrote that? She asked quietly. Malcolm's voice broke when he said, a man who saved me before I ever met him. The crew went still. Even the lights seemed to dim out of respect. The night before the final interview, Malcolm couldn't sleep. He wheeled out to the porch, blanket over his shoulders, the cold air sharp but honest. Nora joined him, carrying tea. What's keeping you up? She asked. He looked at the street, the way the porch light cast a small, steady circle. I'm scared, he said. She frowned. Of what? Of telling this story wrong. Of making it about me when it was always about everyone else. She touched his hand. Then tell it the way you live it, quiet, real, no spotlight needed. He nodded, exhaling slowly. You make it sound simple. It is, she said. That's why it works. The next morning, the camera rolled one last time. Isla asked, if you could speak to the man you used to be, the one who sat alone in that cafe, what would you tell him? Malcolm didn't rush the answer. He stared at his hands, then at the light on the wall. I'd tell him that pity isn't the opposite of pride. Loneliness is. That love will find him when he stops trying to earn it. That one day, a stranger and her child will walk into his life, and they'll teach him that power isn't how loud you speak, it's how gently you stay. Silence followed. It wasn't awkward. It was sacred. When the camera clicked off, Isla wiped her eyes. That's the ending, she whispered. That's the whole story. Months later, when the film premiered at a small theater downtown, people filled every seat. The lights dimmed. On the screen, the first image appeared, the kindness house, a true story. There was no narrator. No soundtrack. Just Malcolm's voice reading from the original letter. If I don't come home one day, tell our girl that love stays. The audience didn't breathe. When the final shot faded, Sky's small hand switching off the porch light at dawn, no one moved. Then, slowly, applause rose like rainfall. Nora looked at Malcolm. His eyes were wet, but his smile was steady. He whispered, he'd be proud, wouldn't he? She nodded. He'd say you finished the work. Later that night, they walked home under streetlights that hummed with their own kind of blessing. Sky skipped ahead, holding the folded flyer from the premiere. On it, someone had printed a line from Malcolm's interview, "We don't heal alone. We build places where healing lives." He stopped at the porch steps, looking up at the light still burning above the door. It had never gone out. Even when the power flickered, even when storms hit, it always found a way back. He turned to Nora, voice soft but certain. "If kindness had a sound," he said, "it would be this house breathing." And somewhere deep in the night, the wind carried the echo of that breath across the city. Through alleys, over bridges, into other homes where someone lonely might look up and see a light that refused to die. The Kindness House had become more than a building. It was a heartbeat, teaching the world how to remember itself. The world found them. It started small, an online clip from the documentary, 15 seconds of Sky's voice saying, "We plant slow here." By morning, it had 20 million views. By noon, journalists camped on the sidewalk. By night, the Kindness House had turned into something Malcolm had feared all his life, a spotlight. Cameras followed deliveries, volunteers, even the porch light. The story spread faster than truth could catch it. Headlines called him the billionaire who bought his soul back. He hated that phrase, it was a receipt pinned to a miracle. Nora tried to keep the calm alive. She hung new curtains, baked muffins for strangers, made coffee for reporters who didn't really want it. But their laughter, so easy, so unguarded, had grown cautious again. Kindness had never been meant for headlines. Malcolm sat in his office late one evening, screens glowing with news articles. The foundation's donations had tripled overnight. Politicians wanted photos. Corporations wanted partnerships. Someone even offered to franchise the model internationally. He closed the laptop, the sound of it shutting like a heartbeat stopping mid-song. Nora entered quietly. "Too much noise?" she asked. He nodded. "We built something sacred. Now they want to sell it in bulk." She leaned against the doorway, arms folded. "Then don't let them." His eyes darkened. "It's not that simple. The board's already talking expansion, investors, branding." She walked closer. "You don't need branding. You need boundaries." He smiled faintly, sad. That's what power always forgets. The next morning, Sky woke early and found two tourists taking selfies by the letter on the wall. One of them said, "This is where the billionaire cried, right?" She frowned, stepping between them. "He wasn't crying," she said. "He was remembering." The man laughed awkwardly. "Cute kid." They left before she could explain that remembering was harder than crying. She told Nora later, her voice small. "They don't understand what the house means." Nora knelt, brushing Sky's hair back. "They will. Some things need to be quiet before they make sense." Days turned into interviews, interviews into noise. The peace that once lived in the halls now hid between camera shutters. Malcolm began to withdraw. He still smiled for photos, still gave speeches, but his words felt like postcards, beautiful, distant, never enough. One night, after another endless charity gala, he came home and found the porch dark. The bulb had burned out for the first time since they opened. He stood there a long time, hand on the railing, heart echoing a single thought. Even light needs rest. He found Nora in the living room, Sky asleep on the couch with a sketchbook half finished in her lap. The drawing showed the house surrounded by people, but the door was closed. Malcolm sat beside her and whispered, "We lost something, didn't we?" Nora nodded. "Not lost. Drowned in applause." He ran a hand through his hair. "How do we get it back?" "By doing what started it," she said. "One quiet act. No cameras. No signatures. Just you remembering why you stayed that day in the cafe." Her words struck deeper than scolding. He sat there, the memory burning like gentle light behind his eyes, the untouched cup, the girl's voice, the choice to look up. He realized fame had the same shape as pity, it both stared and forgot. The next morning, he made a decision. Without announcement, without press, he wheeled into the courtyard where the residents gathered for breakfast. No speeches. No suits. He just began helping. Washing dishes, fixing a broken window latch, folding laundry with hands that had once signed billion-dollar contracts. Word spread through the house like birds released from silence. No one called him sir. They just worked beside him until the noise outside seemed far away again. By afternoon, the cameras still waited out front, but the laughter inside had returned, quiet and real. A new bulb shone on the porch by evening. Sky screwed it in herself, balancing on a chair. "There," she said. It just needed someone to care again. Malcolm watched her, smiling. So do most things. That night, they gathered in the living room, residents, neighbors, even a few reporters who had stayed after hours. Malcolm stood and spoke, voice calm, deliberate. "I once thought light was proof of success," he began. "Now I know it's proof of presence. This house was never built to be famous. It was built so someone lonely could knock on the door and not be asked why now. If you write about us, don't write about the billionaire or the miracle. Write about the woman who stayed. The child who spoke. The letter that waited. Write about what happens when people stop leaving." The room went silent. Even the camera crew lowered their lenses. Nora's eyes filled with quiet pride. Sky clapped once, softly, breaking the spell just enough for everyone to breathe again. Later, when the last guest left, Malcolm walked through each room turning off the lights one by one. Not out of ritual, out of gratitude. The porch light stayed on, as always, but the rest of the house slept in earned peace. He stood at the door, whispering to himself, if fame is a storm, then kindness will always be the eye. And outside, the world kept watching, yet for once, it didn't matter. Because inside, the kindness house had found its heartbeat again. The noise faded. The light returned. And the story, still human, still holy, kept breathing. It was supposed to be a quiet morning. Soft light across the breakfast table. Steam curling from cups of coffee that nobody rushed to drink. The air held the peace of a house that had finally learned how to exhale again. Outside, the news vans were gone. The world had found a new story to chase. And for the first time in months, the kindness house belonged entirely to its people again. Malcolm sat by the window, the chessboard open. He wasn't playing today. He was thinking, the kind of thinking that feels like repair work done by hand. Nora hummed softly as she watered the plants by the hallway, her reflection caught in the glass like a ghost who had chosen to stay. Sky sprawled on the rug, gluing together a paper model of the house. "Don't forget the porch," Malcolm said. She looked up, grinning. "It's the most important part." He smiled. "It always is." By noon, the sound of hammering echoed from the second floor. Malcolm had called a contractor to inspect the walls, the wiring was old, and a few rooms had started to flicker. He and Nora stood at the base of the stairs as the man peeled back a panel of drywall. Behind it, dust, splinters, and something unexpected. A metal box wedged between studs, sealed shut with tape so brittle it crumbled when touched. The contractor frowned. This was here before the remodel. Malcolm reached for it, hands careful. He wiped off the grime. The box was engraved with faint initials, R.E. Nora froze. Her pulse fluttered like something remembering a name too quickly. She whispered, "Robert Ellis." Sky, hearing from downstairs, called out, "Is that Daddy's name?" Nora's voice cracked. "Yes, baby. It is." The contractor offered a screwdriver. Malcolm took it, twisting until the lid creaked open. Inside lay a small stack of papers tied with faded blue ribbon, and a folded scrap of hospital stationery. Nora took the note first. It wasn't dated. The ink had bled in one corner, as if written in rain. "If this house ever stands, it will carry more than my name. It will carry every voice that believed kindness was still louder than loss. And if you find this, it means you finished what I could only begin." Her breath caught. Malcolm's eyes softened. "He hid this here, for us." She nodded, tears slipping freely now. "He must have left it before the accident." Sky climbed the last stair and peered into the box. "What's that?" she asked, pointing at the bundle. Nora untied the ribbon. Inside were sketches, blueprints of rooms that didn't exist in the current layout. One showed a garden. Another, a small circular room labeled Reflection Hall. Malcolm traced the drawing with his finger. "It's a chapel," he said quietly. "But one without pews. Just windows." Nora smiled through her tears. He wanted a place where no one had to kneel to feel forgiven. That afternoon, they gathered everyone, residents, volunteers, neighbors. Malcolm laid the papers on the table, the late sun spilling gold across Robert's handwriting. He said, "Before this house ever existed, there was a man who dreamed it. Not for money. Not for glory. For moments like this." He lifted one page, the circular room, and held it up. This was his last design. "We're going to build it." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. The carpenter, the plumber, the nurse, the cook, they all leaned closer. Nora met their eyes one by one. "We'll build it together. No investors. No board meetings. Just hands and time." Even Sky raised hers. "I can paint." Malcolm grinned. Then it settled. The following weeks turned the house into a heartbeat of hammers and hope. The back garden became the site of their new wing. Small, round, framed with recycled wood and windows that reached almost to the ground. Residents worked in shifts. Children carried paintbrushes like wands. Every night ended with music, voices off-key but honest, the sound of belonging learning its own tune. Nora oversaw the details, her late husband's sketches tucked in her apron pocket. Malcolm supervised from his chair, sleeves rolled, eyes alive with purpose. They called it the Reflection Room. When it was finished, it didn't look like a chapel. It looked like light itself had decided to live indoors. On the evening of its completion, they held no ceremony, just a quiet gathering. The sun was setting through the tall windows, scattering color across the floor like spilled faith. Malcolm rolled forward, touching the wall where the box had been found. He whispered, "He never stopped building, even after he was gone." Nora placed a single candle on the windowsill. "Neither will we." Sky slipped between them, holding something in her small hand, a folded piece of paper she had written herself. She taped it next to the candle. It said, "Daddy made the light." Mr. Malcolm kept it on. Malcolm swallowed hard, blinking against the ache behind his eyes. Nora reached for his hand. "You've done what he couldn't," she said softly. "You gave his kindness a heartbeat." He shook his head. "No. You did. Then, glancing at the candle, he added, I just carried the match. That night, long after everyone had gone to bed, Malcolm stayed in the new room. The candle had burned low. He could see his reflection in the glass, older, lined, but peaceful. He whispered to the darkness, Robert, we built your promise. The wind brushed through the window seam, almost like an answer. He closed his eyes and smiled. The house had found its missing piece. Not just in wood and glass, but in the quiet proof that kindness, once started, refuses to end. And as dawn crept back across the horizon, the kindness house stood taller, not because it grew, but because the people inside it finally did. The candle from the reflection room burned all night. Its flame never wavered, even as wind pressed against the windows like a memory trying to get back in. When morning finally came, the light looked different, not gold, but calm, like the world itself had taken a deep breath. Malcolm woke before the others. He rolled through the hallway, his hands steady, the wheels gliding across wood that whispered under his touch. He stopped in front of the framed letter, Robert's words still there, still waiting, still true. If you find this, it means you finished what I could only begin. He touched the glass, smiling softly. We did. In the kitchen, Nora was already awake. Her robe brushed against the floor as she moved, graceful, unhurried, certain. The kettle hummed its small song. She turned when she felt him watching her. You didn't sleep, she said. He shook his head. Didn't need to. I wanted to see the sunrise hit the reflection room. Nora smiled. Then let's watch it together. They sat side by side as the sun climbed over the city. The light spilled through the tall windows, touching the candle, turning the room into a living photograph. Sky joined them, sleepy-eyed, hair a wild halo. She carried her little paper house in her hands, its porch drawn in crayon gold. Mommy, she whispered, I think Daddy's in the light. Nora's eyes filled, but she didn't cry. Maybe he never left. Malcolm closed his eyes. For the first time, the ache in his chest wasn't pain, it was peace learning how to stay. Weeks passed, gentle and full. The reflection room became the quiet heart of the house. Residents came to sit by the windows, to think, to breathe, to remember. No sermons. No prayers. Just silence, and the understanding that it was enough. People from across the country began to visit. Some came to donate, some to see the letter, some just to sit and listen. The story had spread again, but this time without noise. It wasn't trending. It was traveling, word to word, hand to hand, heart to heart. One evening, an old man arrived. He wore a worn cap and carried a small, dented box. He asked for Malcolm by name. When they met, the man's eyes softened. You don't remember me, he said. But I was at the crash. I was one of the firefighters with Robert Ellis. Malcolm froze. You knew him? The man nodded. He talked about you while we waited for the medics. Said you'd live. Said if you did, something good would come from it. He set the box down. Inside was a badge, tarnished, engraved with Station 27, R. Ellis. I've been keeping it, the man said. Thought maybe one day it should come home. Nora reached out, hands trembling, and touched the badge. The years between grief and grace collapsed into one breath. Malcolm whispered, it already is home. That night, they placed the badge in the reflection room, next to the candle that never went out. Sky drew a new sign for it, 3 words written in big, uneven letters. Love stays here. People began leaving things beside it, photos, folded notes, bracelets, small reminders of what they refused to forget. The table became a quiet altar to everything lost and found. Malcolm started writing again, not speeches or reports, but memories. He wrote about the café, the humiliation, the little girl's question, the nurse who didn't walk away, the letter in the wall, the house that refused to sleep. Each page ended the same way: kindness is the only empire that survives its founder. Nora found the notebook one evening and read it by the fire. When she reached the last page, she looked up at him, tears balanced on a smile. "You've written the ending," she said. He shook his head. "No. Just the beginning of how it keeps going." A year later, on the anniversary of the first house opening, the city dimmed its lights for 1 minute. Every kindness house across the map lit a single candle in its window at the same time. From the sky, it must have looked like a constellation stitched by forgiveness. Reporters called it the night the world remembered itself. But inside the original house, there were no cameras, just the three who started it, watching from the porch. Sky leaned against Malcolm's shoulder. "Why are they turning the lights off?" He whispered, "So we can see how bright one small light really is." She smiled. "Then we'll never run out." Nora took his hand. Her fingers were warm, steady. "Robert was right," she said softly. "Love does stay." Malcolm nodded. "So does kindness. It just needed somewhere to live." The wind rose again, gentle, wrapping around them like something blessing its own creation. The porch light flickered once, then steadied, bright, alive, unafraid. Inside the reflection room, the candle burned low. The flame bent, then straightened, dancing against its shadow. It was small, yes, but it reached the ceiling. It touched the badge, the letters, the drawings on the wall. It touched everything that had once been broken. Malcolm watched it, the reflection painting his face in gold. He whispered, almost to himself, "I used to think light was what we saw. Now I know, it's what we give." Nora rested her head on his shoulder. Sky yawned and whispered, "Good night, Mr. Malcolm." He smiled, voice gentle as sleep itself. "Good night, Sky." And as the candle finally went out, the kindness house didn't grow darker. It simply learned how to glow without flame. Because the real light, the one built from loss and mercy and love that stayed, wasn't in the candle, or the bulb, or the house. It was in them. And so the story ended where all true stories begin, in the quiet certainty that kindness, once lit, never dies.